Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be beginning our program momentarily. Please go ahead and take your seats. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to be starting our program momentarily. Please take your seats. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to be beginning our program. Please take your seats.
After a great lunch, we have a great panel. Actually, we have two great panels this afternoon, in addition to an excellent speaker and a tremendous wrap-up. And that is, this first panel is on risk management in insurance and how you can economically protect yourself in this area. So the second panel will be on water stresses and global food security. This first panel is chaired by Ed Luce, who's the chief U.S. commentator and columnist for the Financial Times. So I'd invite Ed and the panelists to come on up.
Very much, Secretary, for that introduction. I'm not going to read everybody's bios because I think you've got them in front of you. But just to set the scene a little bit for this discussion, we've got 5 genuine experts from very, very different ranges of expertise here, and 1 amateur, and that's me. I'm going to just give you my impression of this report, which will set, I think, frame some of the discussion I hope we're going to have. Being a journalist, I only read this last night in a hurry and was expecting this to be just another dull report, but I was actually really, really struck by what, if I could put it slightly luridly, I saw as a combination of a sort of Malthusian vision with the world's population growing to 8-9 billion, 60% extra food demand by mid-century, and a Dantean depiction of the impact of climate change on this, with 2% reduction in annual food growth every year. And these two facts really did quite alarm me. It's not often that I read big think tank reports and sit up that bolt upright. So we've got very, very expert people on this panel, but I have a very, very big journalistic sort of frame for approaching this topic of managing risk in the age of climate change and weather volatility. Let me start with Patrick O'Toole, who's head of the Family Farm Alliance, and I think for me, more interestingly, a big rancher, a cattle and sheep rancher, am I right in saying?
Yes, sir.
On the Wyoming-Colorado border. And even more interestingly, it's your wife's family's ranch, is that correct? And
yes,
she's
sir.
had it since 1883. So you've got some institutional memory there about the impact of changing climate. Right. Locally on how it is to be a farmer. And I'd love, first of all, to hear from you, since we're here in the United States, and since you're a rancher in the west of it, what have you seen in terms of climate change and its impact on farming?
Oh, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to visit with you all. You know, it's interesting, especially when you put it in the context of multiple generations. My grandchildren of the 6th generation on our ranch, and our responsibility is to keep them doing it. And what we've seen is volatility. 3 years ago, we had the wettest year in our history, 350% of normal snowpack. Our ranch is up on above the river, and we never thought flooding would be an issue, and we had to replace all of our French drains because everything flooded. The next year was the driest year in the 130 years that we've been there. And so managing for volatility is really something that we're thinking about a lot. And part of our reputation, not just in our family, but our watershed, is problem solvers. I'm very fortunate. I call it standing on the shoulders of giants, and in my wife's family, they had very little feet, but they were giants. And, you know, this sort of intergenerational look at the resource. And what we are so fortunate to have is a conservation district, which is very dynamic with great leadership and a vision of where we're going to go. And so you look at, what does it mean immediately to me? It's usually about water. It's about storms. 2 weeks ago, we finished shearing just as the rain came. We were really happy about that, and unfortunately it turned to snow and killed about 150 lambs that night. And so part of the way that we're looking at our business is how do we manage the risk, the volatility that we're seeing with dry years, wet years, intense storms. For example, we're building a new lambing shed. And even though we're on green grass when we lamb, we want to have a little bit more ability to control that. But we're also working sort of on a macro sense. We're right at the headwaters of the Colorado River. So the Continental Divide is 25 miles above our ranch, and we in our district have decided that we're going to look at a lot of the more challenging issues of the Endangered Species Act and climate in a very progressive way. So we began, about 12 years ago, working with Fish and Wildlife Service and Trout Unlimited and a lot of different partners, USDA, to integrate our irrigation and our fishery. And it was sort of an experiment that turned into be a community-wide effort to look at a long-term, how do you preserve Upper Colorado endangered fish. And what's interesting is to watch the dynamics of a community. You know, and in some of the earlier talks today, there was this why, you know, what do farmers think about climate? And at least in the West, people are very distrustful of government. There's just no arguing that. And so if you were to present, you know, a question as to, you know, how are you going to have the government tell you what to do in terms of X, Y, or Z, they're going to probably not do that. But if it's presented in the case of let's try to make our entire systems more vibrant and you know, look at the holistic way of dealing with our watershed, people really bought in after they established trust. And so, you know, I've been very fortunate to, you know, to watch people with vision, plan for the future, plan for volatility. But the realities of at least our lives is that in the Western livestock business, let me just say, if you're a Midwestern crop person, there are crop insurances and other safety nets. There really isn't for the Western livestock industry, and it may emerge out of this farm bill that there becomes some. And so you're very cognizant that losses are permanent. You know, when the fellow talked about the corn laying down in the warm in the rain and it came back up, well, the lambs didn't do that. I mean, once they were gone, they were gone. And I think, you know, part of what we've got to understand if we're going to in fact have a more volatile climate, which I believe that we're in the middle of already, we've got to have safety nets, because if the bottom line is, you know, and I'll just kind of divert a little bit. I was listening to NPR the other day, and there was a debate about India moving from a lot of small farms to more of an American system potentially. And one of the comments was, in America, didn't you know there's more prisoners than farmers? And I'm not commenting on the penal system, but I'm telling you that the concern of losing farmers is huge. And I think we've got to move it into that context.
We're doing sort of opening remarks with my opening questions, but just to, before we move on to Schengen Fan, the volatility you're experiencing, you mentioned you lost 150 lambs. You have no doubt that climate change is playing a role and that volatility is increasing because of climate change. And is this confirmation bias, or is this actually a genuinely held view by farmers across the West?
I think if you put it in the context of climate change at the coffee shop, they wouldn't like to have that discussion. Mm-hmm. But I think what people believe and really understand, not just in my community, but West-wide, is that storage, for example, is crucial. You know, we've got to understand that you're going to have faster runoffs. This year we're probably 3 to 4 weeks ahead. And so if you're going to be 3 to 4 weeks ahead, you've got to store water to have the ability to have it later. And people buy into that, absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Schengen Fan, you're the head of the International Food Policy Research Group here in Washington, D.C. You were previously at the World Economic Forum in charge of precisely those kinds of issues there. So you have a bird's eye view of what impact, if any, yet climate change is having on international food security and national food securities. Could you talk a little bit about what exactly you're seeing and the degree to which climate change can be attributed for the kinds of food price volatility we've been seeing in the last few years?
Well, good afternoon. Well, let's recall what happened in 2007, 2008 food price crisis. So food prices increased by 50%, 100% within 6 months to 1 year. Why? Well, there are many reasons. Investment in agriculture, particularly in agricultural research, the competition between biofuel and food, many other reasons. But it is extreme weather events, drought, in some of, actually in Australia, that triggered the global food price crisis. And I'm afraid as climate change will become a reality, the food prices will continue to rise very high and it become more volatile. IPRI has a model. I think some of the results in the report actually use some of the model we have been doing at IPRI, shows that from now to 2050, many food prices will continue to rise to a very high level. For example, wheat will be by more than 100%, so we'll see double the wheat prices. Maize will be increased by more than 50%, rice almost 40%. So we're not afraid of higher prices. What we are afraid is volatility. So today is high, tomorrow is low. We know that after the food crisis, many people suffered. Hundreds of millions of people suffered from hunger, malnutrition, particularly women and children. And we know that for children, if they suffer from malnutrition, the cost is forever. Cost is permanent. It's like a death penalty. So you ask what we should do at the national level. I think we have to go beyond just the national level. Global level, national level, community level, even household level. At a global level, we have to continue to work to make sure that trade will remain open, fair, and transparent. We know that after 2007, 2008 food crisis, many countries begin to impose certain restrictions on trade. And that actually exacerbated the price volatility, so we needed to avoid doing that. At the national level, investment in agricultural research, not just to increase the yield, but also to build the tolerance against heat, drought, flood, I think we have heard a lot, and also to enhance the nutrition. Recently, there was a report to show that the climate change actually will reduce the nutrition contents of many crops. So how can we really use research technologies to enhance crop nutrition through breeding, not necessarily fortification, biofortification, through biofortification. So, and certain stocks at a national level to make sure that if there is a crisis, the country can move the stocks to the poorest region to help the poor to have access to food. I think the community level plays a huge role. This is often ignored by the development community. So the community, the village level in many parts of the world, in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, so they work together to make sure that they can deal with certain crises, whether it's a drought, whether it's a flood, or diseases, particularly animal-related diseases. And more importantly, obviously, it's people. How households can build the resilience against the various shocks. So they must be able to access to food through a social protection program. We have heard about the Ethiopia case. So when crisis came, the poor people can access to food, at least in short run, then they will be able to build their assets for long-term growth, particularly production productivity growth. We just had a conference last week. IPRI held a conference in Addis Ababa on the very much related issue, that is building resilience for food and nutrition security. Mm-hmm. So how can we really make sure that the system at the various levels can build a strong resilience against the various shocks, which will become very often and intense. And many African leaders, African community leaders, national leaders, researchers, NGOs came together, so they try to figure out how can we really do business as unusual to tackle the resilience issues after the crisis.
I'll get back to some of the solutions in the second round when we get into more of a conversation, but Darcy Vetter is the Undersecretary for Farms and Foreign Agricultural Assistance at the USDA. And I think more interestingly, you're moving to the USTR, back to the USTR, to head the agricultural negotiating team there, and got back, I think I'm right in saying, last night at 11 p.m.
Yes.
from Singapore, where you've been doing TPP negotiations on trifling matters like Japanese agricultural tariffs. And most importantly, you grew up on a farm in Nebraska.
Yes.
So you've got a fork to farm perspective on all of this.
Yeah.
Only about a quarter of the world's food crosses borders. So food trade isn't as big as other forms of trade. What role can trade and trade policy play in addressing the problems we're talking about? Mr. Pham touched on some of that in terms of his reference to the export restrictions that came in 2008.
That's right. And I think, first of all, you're right that 25% of that global food production is traded. But when you think about how many of our farmers in the world are really participate as a subsistence level, and where most of their trade may be local, thinking about 25% of global ag production going across borders is actually quite a lot. And it's a really growing number. And it's growing both in volume, but also in value and in variety. So I think in the past we used to think about ag trade as a big container full of soybeans, a big ship full of soybeans. Now it's meat products, it's dairy, it's processed foods, it's more consumer oriented, where a lot of value is being added at home. So the profile and the number of countries participating as both importers and exporters is also changing, and I think that has real implications for food security. I think trade really can be a tool in helping mitigate the impacts of climate change, and can be used in ways that can prevent further damage or could exacerbate climate change itself. In its most obvious form, trade is used to move where there's a supply to where there's a demand. And in the case of food, that often means where we produce a surplus to places where there is food deficit. And we've talked a little bit about volatility. I know this morning we talked about how there's an impact on production itself, how extreme weather events, drought, all of those make it more likely, perhaps, that there are times of lower yield than one might expect. And so the ability to quickly move food across borders to places where there is surplus to deficit becomes continually important. Trade in food is also very important for nutrition. Not every place can grow every kind of crop, and we know it's important to have a variety of foods, fruits, vegetables, staples, in order to have a very healthy and resilient diet, and trade in food helps contribute to that. But I also think that when we tend to think about trade in food, we think about a big barge full of something traveling a really long distance, when in fact a lot of global trade is among neighbors, who sometimes can be only a few miles apart, but the natural distance to the nearest market happens to cross an international border. And if we can facilitate that happening, the production in rural areas reaching their closest urban center, their closest natural market, without barriers of high tariffs, with predictable customs procedures, we can really help address not only food security, but climate change problems. If you take, for example, a country like Mozambique, long and skinny, and you've got, Maputo, its capital, in the south. The natural agricultural areas that might feed that urban center might well be in South Africa or Zimbabwe. And if I'm a farmer up in northern Mozambique, the best place to take my crops is probably to Tanzania. But if there are strict trade barriers along those borders, I might transport goods hundreds of miles in hot weather on bad road conditions to try and feed that urban center. And the amount of post-harvest loss that can be associated with that can be very devastating. And the cost of transporting that food can really eat into the profits of that local producer. So the food security of the farmer themselves is undermined because they don't get the profits from and can't, feed their own families better. But we can't afford the loss of calories by having bad trade policy. That post-harvest loss can be really devastating to food security regionally if we let that happen. So again, lack of reducing high tariffs, making sure customs procedures are reliable and not burdensome are incredibly important. Another key part, however, of good trade policy is good data policy. So if I'm the farmer in northern Mozambique, I want to know what I'm going to get paid if I send my crop to Tanzania. I need an openness and a transparency in that market, locally. But also, I think we have a real opportunity that many of our farmers trade in global commodity markets. And if we have better and more transparent data about supply and demand, we can help reduce some of the price shocks we saw in 2008 with wheat supplies. I think we did a better job of that in 2012 when we saw a real spike in corn prices. But data got out there quickly to say that while there was shortage in some areas, overall global stocks, in fact, looked pretty good. And so the impact of that spike was shorter and much less because there wasn't truly a global supply problem there. And we already talked about export restrictions. I think putting in place those high barriers can exacerbate the problem, sends the wrong signal to farmers that by depressing prices locally when in fact there's great demand globally and they should be producing more rather than less and responding in that way. And the last thing I would say about trade as a way to really mitigate the effects of climate change is that good trade policy includes the adoption and implementation of good international standards for food safety and for animal and plant health. And that the rules-based trading system really recognizes those standards. They try to get standards adopted across countries that are the same so that one, if you're a producer and you can meet those science-based standards, you can send your crops many different places and have them be accepted. And if you're a food safety or an animal and plant health professional that you have an internationally agreed standard that if you can reach that, if you can look at crops at the border coming in, you feel relatively safe that both your consumers and your livestock and your plants are protected, which is, of course, increasingly important as you see climatic variability and you see pests entering new regions they haven't been before, both animal and plant health pests, as well as human diseases and the food safety impact that brings. So I think there are just generally, those are sort of 3 or 4 different places where good, sound trade policy can be really important for mitigating the impacts of climate change.
Well, we'll get back into more detail about trade negotiations and how you can integrate some of the recommendations of this report into that, which I think would be of great interest. James Cameron, you're founder of the Climate Change Fund, which invests in agriculture and technologies related to climate change. You're also on the British Prime Minister's business advisory. I presume you're no relation to David.
No,
no. You don't look like.
Neither do I make films.
Yeah, just wanted to check. And you've been involved, of course, you're head of the Overseas Development Institute. So you have a private sector and a public sector perspective on this. Let me ask you, we've had an IPCC report recently. We've had an American National Climate Change report as well. These are very visible, very public, very, very definitive scientific statements about what's going on. What impact have they had on private investment decisions?
Well, they're both, well, they're more than those two, but the scientific evidence and the compendiums that are being prepared, and this is another one, and most welcome, thank you very much, Chicago Council, help explain to investors how the world is. This is the real world. Investors like to use phrases like that. They like sometimes to dismiss what they think are idealistic notions of where money ought to go with an answer, well, in the real world, we have to make decisions to produce financial returns. We have fiduciary responsibilities to our beneficiaries, and therefore, we won't be looking at this unusual alternative investment you've suggested in renewable energy or sustainable agriculture or some such. And the great benefit of these major scientific and analytical studies is they help explain to an investor of any size and type how the world is now and how it is likely to be in all probability over an investment period that can resonate with an investor of various types. Now, having said that, we do not have a very effectively functioning financial system for dealing with these issues. We are woefully short-term. We have very little alignment of interest between the interest of a beneficiary receiving a pension over many decades and the interest of a fund manager being rewarded on returns achieved in an incredibly short period of time, with daily calculations of profit and loss and quarterly reporting from large listed companies. Many of the investments that make sense in this world that we are now looking at and forced to confront are illiquid long-term investments. They're real assets. They have very interesting yields. They produce the kind of dividends that pension funds are actually looking for. But they tend to lack the capacity internally to make those investments. Very often they don't have experts in infrastructure in Africa. They then have to find someone who does. There isn't a large community of specialist fund managers to do that work. More now, thank goodness, but not a great deal. And it's very difficult to move people out of established ways of allocating their capital. Fear and threat are not enough. There has to be opportunity, and it has to be relatively more attractive opportunity now. So one of the challenges we've got, and it's a severe one for the institutional investor community in particular, is to substitute what gives them returns today with what will give them returns today and tomorrow that delivers these essential benefits to our society, which means reducing greenhouse gas emissions. It means properly valuing the natural systems upon which we depend for our livelihoods. And some of that is in turn dependent upon good public policy making. So this is why you find institutional investors will join in big enterprises like the Carbon Disclosure Project, CDP, and some of these investor initiatives. They will use those multi-investor initiatives to call for a price for carbon, for example. Almost, I don't think I've ever come across a serious institutional investor of any size who doesn't think it's a good idea to have a price for carbon, something you don't often hear in national politics. Right? But they also lack reliable prices for water. They also don't really know how to value the stock that's in a watershed. They also have very little to go by to understand what other aspects of a thriving ecosystem might mean for an investment in a real asset, and they have yet to revalue assets that are going to be affected by climate change, whether it's a road or a railway or a cannery or a piece of land that is vulnerable to flooding.
So there's a great deal of demand there, an appetite, but the institutional structures and the time horizons are something to work on. Well, let's get back into that and talk a little bit about specific investments as well you'd recommend. Yep. Jürgen Trubb, you're head of energy and commodities at Swiss Re, one of the world's biggest insurance groups. It's always struck me that in the absence of what James just mentioned, which is political will, and the absence of an actual carbon price or cap and trade scheme in a country like the United States, that we might have to fall back on a secondary hope, which is that the cost of insurance and reinsurance in places like Miami will get so high that the private sector actually lobbies government to do something about climate change. What are you seeing as a senior insurer at the cutting edge of climate and energy? What are you seeing in terms of your position in the market?
Well, let's first talk a bit about the emissions and the mitigation of climate, and then go to the adaptation and the volatility. We, as an insurer, we're very much affected by natural catastrophes. We're also affected by the risks that we assume from the agricultural sector or from the energy sector. And therefore, we have obviously an interest to mitigate climate change as much as we can. And therefore, we come in, for example, trying to shape the political decision-making at the conference of the parties. We disseminate information. We do research about things like climate adaptation measures or mitigation measures. We're actually kind of ranking them depending upon their effectiveness. But then our main function, obviously, is to absorb that volatility that we just spoke about and to price it. And maybe, yes, depending upon what we see, because we always take measured risks, it could be that prices become so high that political and societal will actually will help to bring.
But are you seeing any of those
action.
price trends yet? I mean, are you seeing
well,
catastrophe insurance?
I think the thing is our durations are usually on an annual basis. So kind of in the short term, it's difficult to see big changes, but over the long run, certainly we see big changes. And it also depends a bit upon what type of risk you assume. So the natural catastrophe business is obviously something that should occur relatively seldom, and so the probability to see short-term changes at the tail of a distribution is less as opposed to the probability to see changes at the money, so kind of in the middle of a distribution. And therefore, particularly in our energy business, where essentially we de-risk the cash flow volatilities of utilities, gas or power utilities, where we see around the world a lot of change, and we take it into account in our pricing. In a kind of similar situation, we're seeing the agricultural business. There it depends upon how much of the expected yield you can insure. Can you insure something that allows you for a payout of the 1 standard deviation, 2 standard deviations, and so on? So that kind of obviously affects how quickly you see climate change coming in. And then depending upon region, we see kind of changes in the volatility pattern. So, sometimes if you look into time series, you see that maybe 10, 20 years ago, there was a change, a shift in regime in the volatility of the weather.
Let me ask you, but I'm going to throw out a general question in a moment for everybody, but let me ask you and Sheng and Fan a particular question. We've heard a lot about what technology can do for farmers at the local level. They can get real-time price information, they can get weather forecasts with increasingly volatile weather systems, they can adapt their crop patterns or whatever to this kind of, with the help of this kind of technology. The developing country I know best, India, has hundreds of millions of farmers. Some of them are semi-literate or even illiterate, and many of them don't have electricity. How practical, I understand how good the technology is, how practical is it to get, for example, weather derivatives, weather volatility derivatives, into the hands of a cotton farmer in Maharashtra, for example, and have them on the ground on that kind of scale, adapting their behavior? And I wanted to ask you two, because you're coming at completely different ends to the problem.
Well, we started that business.
Your mic is...
So can you hear me?
Yeah.
So we started that business roughly around 2003, essentially after the Indian government, together with the World Bank, asked what can be done. We developed it with the local partners, and I think with POSIX at that time, a micro insurance organization, and ICICI Lombard, the local direct insurance company. And it's insurance, by the way, not derivatives.
Your mic isn't brilliant. You might have to sort of project a little bit more.
And I think it was helping because it took the farmers around 2 years or more to get the benefit of the existing indemnity-based scheme. Now the fact that we settled on a parametric index allowed to settle much faster, and therefore farmers could really see the benefit of that particular type of insurance. And it's a big success story because now
we're having a serial mic problem with Swiss Ray.
Better now?
It is for me, but I'm quite close to you.
Can you hear me?
There you go, yeah.
Okay. So what I wanted to say is that, so around 2003 we started that, essentially to solve a market that was not functional because farmers benefited just around 2 years from after a bad harvest from the payout of the previously existing scheme, and using parametric insurance allowed them to have much earlier the benefit of a payout. That actually then helped them to get access to credit and so on. And it was insurance, not derivative. So that's what I wanted to say. And it's a big success story because from virtually nothing in 2003, that market developed into a market where nowadays roughly around 5 or 6 million people profit from the insurance.
Schengen.
Yeah, here I think probably we need some sort of institutional innovations here to make sure that the farmers can have access or better understanding about the insurance. The one is, can we bundle the insurance with microfinance, microcredit? So that's one way we can try. The second is community-based insurance. And finally, probably different type of payments. We did some experiments, or IPRI did some experiments in Ethiopia and China through all kinds of different innovations. By doing that, the demand for insurance can double. So the farmers. So we needed to look at some sort of business unusual case or out-of-box institutional innovations that can serve millions of farmers, as you mentioned.
Patrick, I want to bring you into this because you did mention specifically the lack of federal insurance for some of the problems you're facing in the West. Is this something, could you get specific climate change insurance? Is that something you're arguing for? Is that something that Western farmers and farmers all over the US would benefit from?
My own personal view is it needs to be event specific, and it needs to be based on what happens in a specific instance rather than an insurance, because I think it's very complicated stuff. It's not a crop that's on the ground, but the interpretation of USDA, for example, on how you would deal with that in a crisis basis needs to be pretty apparent, transparent to the producer, so they have some idea what their expectations and what to do. There was a big storm called the Atlas storm. I don't know if you remember that in South Dakota. It was just the first time I've ever heard of a Western storm getting a name, and I think it was a reality check as to just how an event just so devastating isn't just the event itself, but it's the follow-up. What do you do next? I don't think there's a clear picture of what do you do next.
So presumably, part of your answer is insurers, you'd have to prove it's climate change related, and insurers can always wriggle out of that one. But a federal guarantee for, I don't know, water shortages or extreme weather volatility is something you are after. Again,
go to California, where maybe the worst drought ever, one of the worst droughts ever. And what's interesting about it, it's both a drought and a regulatory drought. Because as you might know, the Endangered Species Act forced hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of acre-feet of water to go into the bay for dubious reasons. And I think, what we have to make, you ask my view is it's going to get worse rather than better. Cattle prices are good because there's only half the producers there were 70 years ago. We're watching this sort of low or long, steady attrition that we have to come up with better answers. I'm not an expert on the insurance part of it, but I'm an expert on what it takes to make sure that the banker stays with you.
So this is my general, sorry, Jürgen.
So, I think I would totally agree. Presumably it's not the issue to have climate change insurance or such, but actually insure against a certain event that is...
Sorry, I didn't mean any disrespect to insurers.
I just wanted to say, I think you want to insure against a certain event that puts you at risk, you as a client.
Indeed.
And I think that's the
point taken.
Key. And at the end of the day, I think insurance should then help to be a safety net, to allow access to credit. As you said, kind of bundle it maybe with seeds, with microcredit, to really make sure that farmers have a living even after a drought, that they can pay back their credits, that they can feed their families, send the kids to school. I think that's really the benefit.
So, James?
Could I just add a minor point of correction for you there, Ed?
You can add as many as you like.
I think it was somewhere around 1990. I did some work with my colleagues then in service of a group of small island states that became the Alliance of Small Island States that we represented for many years in the climate negotiations on insurance. And what triggered that work was a colleague who discovered Swiss Re and Munich Re's data on sea level rise. And for many of these island states, it was impossible to get insurance for infrastructure at the coastal margin, for example, because sea level rise was an uninsurable risk because it was inevitable in 1990. Right? So that was the real life situation of a small developing country faced with the evidence of climate science then, as endorsed not just by the IPCC then, but the reinsurance industry who had the data in 1990.
That's a devastating anecdote. The general question I had is, I mean, you're all experts. None of you are elected officials. You've got policy approaches, or private sector approaches, or on-the-ground approaches to how to deal with this. And you know some of the solutions, and you know that there are technical solutions, at least to some of what we're talking about. The politics is a problem, not just here, but everywhere in the world. The Chicago Council report makes a very interesting and I think very salient recommendation that we have a Congress enabling act to make international food security part of US foreign policy and to codify, as Administrator Shah put it, to codify all of the stuff we're talking about. Let me start with you, Darcy, but others can jump in because this isn't just America we're talking about, but let me start with you. What are the practicalities of getting a bill like that through Congress? You've worked on the Hill before. And what would be the benefit of it succeeding?
Gosh, that's a tall order to ask me how to get that bill passed. You know, I think rather than talk about specific legislation, I think it is important to note that there are a lot of places where the groundwork is being laid to talk about food security as also being national security policy. I think you've seen, you know, the Department of Defense talking about climate change as key to influencing global migration and instability. A key part of that, of course, is access to food and food-secure populations, and insecurity driving some of that migration as a result of climate change and other climate variability. So I think in places that people sometimes didn't expect, there's a climate change conversation popping up, or you know, a food security conversation popping up because of the impact it has on demographics, on national security, on the ability of other governments to govern, and you know, the impacts that branch out from there. So I do think the groundwork is being laid to think about food security as not sort of a niche issue or just a feeding hungry people issue, but rather being a foundation of you know, stable governance and good governance and alliances and managing natural resources generally. So I think that is being done. And I think, you know, the ramifications of that, I wasn't able to hear Raja's full presentation today, but, you know, he talks a lot about the difference between responding to emergencies and really building a true food secure situation, and without sort of recognizing the interrelated nature of these different aspects of our foreign and our food policy, you don't get to that place very well, and that's really what we're trying to do. I know at USDA, we focus a lot on, and work with USAID on agricultural development, but we focus on the piece of that that's building agricultural markets. So not just the feeding programs themselves, but looking at how we can help those economies have more transparent and better market data, how they can export and market their goods regionally as well as locally, how they can add value. And we find, you know, a key part of the area of agriculture I work in is at advancing U.S. ag trade. But if you can build incomes by having a more resilient ag sector in those other countries, they become our customers. They, you know, we can participate with them in a back and forth trade relationship that really influences, and in a positive way, both of our incomes and our resiliency. And so I think you'll see more policies like that coming out of policy.
Let's ask Schengen, what kind of impact this bill would have. I won't ask you to prognosticate whether it could pass, but just what kind of impact could a bill like this
I think the political economy of policy making is critical here. I remember when I traveled to India to have a dialogue with the Indian policymakers, let's say the Planning Commission, said, hey, Schengen, what you told me, I know all this, you don't need to tell me, but I have political constituents that I needed to have them to support me or support my party. I think here the critical missing point here is the knowledge information that have to be communicated to the general political constituents, let's say whether it's the farmers or consumers. Do they really know certain policy is good for them? Sometimes they don't know. For example, the subsidies, water, fertilizers, electricity subsidies. I think this issue was mentioned this morning. You know, so over-subsidization leads to overuse of all these inputs. That also needed to more carbon emissions. But why don't we do something? The part of the reason is farmers actually don't know there is a better option for them. That is to reduce the subsidies, use that money either to support them directly through income support or invest in, let's say, in agriculture research, in improving infrastructure. So the farmers will be able to have more reliable, cheaper access to electricity and water. So do they have this knowledge? If the farmers have that knowledge, then they will push their political system to change a certain policy that will be favorable to them. So this is actually the research topic by itself.
And just specifically on the bill that the Chicago Council are recommending, you're, as an international food policy expert, I'm interested in, well, in everybody's views, but yours just in particular, how big a difference, Shengen, could that?
Well, again, I think the knowledge, evidence-based knowledge is very important. For example, this report is a first step. We need to communicate this report, not just to the people in the room, to everybody here in America. So they will know the importance of this issue.
Of talking about this as a national security issue.
Or national security, or it's
because I think that's what people, like, they have their humanitarian silo in one side of their head, and they have foreign threats in the other. And what's valuable to me about this report is it's the same
add one thing. For example, the American farmers, in fact, they have pretty good heart. When I talk to them, if we have introduced certain policies that may not be good for poor and hungry people in Africa, they're actually quite sympathetic. But sometimes they need that knowledge, information.
Yeah. James, your namesake came into office promising action on climate change, and not much has happened. Since you've got the same name, if not the same blood, and you live in the same country, give me your angle on the difficulty of the politics of climate change and international food security from a British point of view.
So these things ebb and flow. You have moments when it seems entirely possible to have big breakthroughs in public policy and lawmaking. And by the way, it's perhaps in this town in particular quite hard to endorse the value of law. One can be pretty cynical about lawyers, the amount of lawyers in politics. But at base, at heart, law is an ideal. Law is a will to perfection. Law is the way of making the best of our intentions. And it matters to come to agreement. It matters to shake hands and agree that this norm will be applied in the institutions that deliver the rule of law. It really matters. It matters in the US. It matters between states. It matters in our trade relations. It matters that our trade laws are enforced in a dispute settlement procedure in Geneva. This all matters. And it matters to investors. It matters to people who organize their other commercial relationships in their private contractual arrangements. And it matters for registering what really counts in a society. And security is a very good word for us to focus on. And in this instance, thanks very much to work of this type, we are able to better understand the relationship between three interrelated securities: food, energy, and water. Now, they all relate to climate change. And climate change, unfortunately, is one of those issues that covers almost every aspect of human existence, which makes it somewhat overwhelming and extremely difficult to manage. But it doesn't get managed unless you zoom in on things that can be done. And you take as many small steps as possible towards a much larger goal of reducing risk. So my sense is that we have the right language when we use security. We are right to dedicate effort to rule-making, to the establishment of an understanding of what matters and written down in law. But equally, the innovation that's required to deal with these complex problems will emerge in all kinds of ways that no government will ever know. They'll happen spontaneously. They'll happen because someone just really has an insight that they develop on their own, unstimulated by public policy. They'll happen because of a commercial relationship, a supply chain relationship which will incentivize someone to come up with an answer that their customer wants. So we mustn't pretend that there is a public policy-driven solution to everything in this great complex space.
It is part of the solution.
It's a vital part of the solution, and it matters a great deal that we put effort into getting that public policy right. But my sense is that we have, as in many other areas of life, a relationship between creativity and constraint here. When human beings are faced with real constraint, they get creative. They imagine better ways of doing things. Now, that in turn also affects the way we think about law, because many people in the commercial world have become, I think, lazy with the notion that regulation is always an unwelcome constraint, that somehow stifles economic activity. Well, it just doesn't. There are all kinds of businesses that feed off regulation, innovate and produce more business in an economy. So when you have these very vital concerns, public goods concerns, it's perfectly proper for governments to give them priority to regulate or to stimulate commercial reaction by choosing policy instruments. And we have one of those instances here, and I wish whoever's making the running with these arguments the very best of luck in this particular Congress.
Now, I presume everybody on the panel expects that the kind of sudden price rises and price volatility we saw in 2008 will continue to happen. Now, you can't say exactly when, but this is likely to keep recurring. And should therefore be, and the political fallout from such price spikes in places like the Middle East, Mexico, wherever, will continue to be a danger, if not a growing danger. How do we integrate this into our international economic language? And I mean, trade in particular, of course, is a key aspect, Darcy. You're about to be confirmed as the key agricultural negotiator for the US.
Please tell the Senate.
Yeah, I will communicate it forthwith. What role could food security measures and international food trade measures play in TPP, for example? And to what extent are your efforts directed already in that way?
You know, I think there are several structures in sort of the in a bilateral trade negotiation, there are sort of two aspects that we look at. There's the market access negotiation, which is how we and our trading partners are going to reduce our agricultural tariffs to one another, which of course allows for easier and freer trade in food. And then there's the section we call the rules part of the agreement. And that includes disciplines on making sure you have science-based measures on sanitary and phytosanitary rules, this, mitigating the impacts of trade, or making sure that we can protect animal and plant health and food safety, for example. That if we're all following the same set of rules about how we set that policy, then it's easier to trade. But there are some other aspects that I think we don't necessarily think of as promoting food security, but that are key in trade negotiations as well. And one is a general chapter on transparency, where when countries do adopt these new rules, that they notify them to the WTO, they notify trading partners, that they publish changes in regulation and how they intend to move forward. And of course, that's a huge opportunity then for producers to adapt to new market opportunities, to provide comment if they see that the way that new rules might be implemented could in fact have a detrimental impact on the ability for goods to move across borders. And so that applies not only to changes directly in trade policy, but also environmental and labor policy and other aspects that fall under the rubric of that trade agreement that of course can have a big impact on climate change. And on food security more generally. There are chapters, for example, on intellectual property protection and on trade and services, which I think are increasingly important for food security. If we look at developing new varieties using biotechnology, nanotechnology to address some of those underlying problems in virus resistance, salt tolerance, nutrition in foods, that sort of second generation of those products that can be useful. And then also, I think a key part when we talk about ag trade that we forget to talk about sometimes, and has really been brought up on this panel, is trade and agricultural services.
Yeah.
And there are companies that have developed real expertise on how to use resources better, how to get better growth out of livestock, how to deal with some of these areas of volatility in crop production. And that in itself is a good or a service that we should be exporting and sharing that knowledge and developing it well. So, I think easing the barriers to all those kinds of things are ways that trade agreements in their general structure contribute to food security. There's also work, I think, in the WTO context that could be done more to provide trade capacity building, education about international animal and plant health standards, for example, and how they can be broadly applied and adopted in countries where, frankly, it takes a lot of capacity to do risk assessments and to set those policies well. We could be doing more there.
Schengen.
Yeah, very briefly, on WTO trade negotiation, you might remember last December in Barney, the ministerial level meeting, the two agreements. One is obviously the trade facility. Yeah. The other one is actually very much related to what we have discussed here, food security. So India proposed a so-called food security clause. And I think it's great that we put food security very high in any trade negotiation, but we have to be very careful that we do not use trade to protect certain inefficiency. For example, in the case of India, India government wants to make sure that they will have the ability to purchase the food from farmers at the administered price, then redistribute the food to poor people through subsidies. I mean, you have to be very careful that the over subsidies, even in terms of distribution, has opportunity cost. Is there a better way to spend that money? For example, to increase its productivity through investment in research, in rural infrastructure, climate smart agriculture. Probably, yes, subsidy is very much needed, but the subsidy has to be targeted. Subsidy has to be efficient and make sure that it reaches to.
There's an assumption underlying this report, but also a lot of discussions around this subject that we can have a second or third green revolution, whatever number it is, that the science is doable as long as the will and the money is there. Does everybody agree with that?
Yeah. Yeah.
That we can develop crops that will withstand some of the extreme heat that's being forecast with the salination of water we're already experiencing, all the sort of climate-related weather patterns, that we can get science that will improve crop productivity in the teeth of these trends. Does everybody agree with that?
Most definitely.
You all agree with that? Sorry, James.
I also think that it's an opportunity for investment of a scale that should be attractive to all institutional investors, wherever they are in the world, including the increasingly large amounts of capital being accumulated in the emerging economies. So in my experience with this one particular investment in Tanzania, you can see real improvement in yields, not just from technology, but from new ways of doing business. So just to illustrate the needs to combine finance, technology, in this case, very little public policy, but some engagement of public assistance, public aid money, and new ways of doing business. This is a 5,000-hectare rice farm in Tanzania, where we made an arrangement with the smallholders who are on the land to share space, to regularize their position on that land, to bring in, with the assistance, thank you very much, of USAID, eventually, a smallholder rice program to improve their yields. The smallholders have an option, not an obligation, to sell their rice through us, to have their rice milled in our mill or just dried, or they can sell it on the road outside in market prices. In the space of a single season, they had, in some instances, some of those farmers had doubled their yields and were making decisions like, I'm going to send my daughter to school now. Transformative in a very short period of time. That technology is not complex. But the next phase of development of that asset involves using the waste to create energy. It means that the entire valley now might have access to sustainable energy as a result of what is happening on our property. The infrastructure is still poor. But you can see quite clearly what happens when the first steps to improve productivity lead on to the next and the next. And that is an agricultural region now that has tremendous potential, into which you could bring a real breakthrough technological advancement that might have been pioneered in another country. Mm-hmm. And I remain resolutely optimistic that when you combine those things, finance, technology, and hopefully helpful public policy, we'll be dealing very well with this extremely challenging set of security issues.
Patrick, I wanted to ask you the same question.
Well, let me just put a little turn on it. You know, I have what every farmer wants. 2 children on the farm and 6 grandchildren. That's what you want, that hope for the future. But I will tell you, Family Farm Alliance wrote a paper on climate in 2007, and no ag groups were writing papers on climate in 2007. And it's still a little dicey as to what, you know, what the debate's going to be about. And it was the head of the HHS at the federal government, Tom Thompson, talked about laying awake at night and worrying about our food supply. And so our response was, it is a national security issue, so that was, you know, 7 years ago. But also, the answers are flexibility and adaptability. That's what farmers need. And what farmers are afraid of, and you want to know what they talk about in the coffee shop, is that the natural inclination of government is to assert control, not to give more flexibility and more adaptability. And, you know, there's all of the statistics that we can go back and forth on, but the one that's the driver that was mentioned earlier today is the average age of farmers. I shouldn't be the average age of farmers, maybe even above it.
Yeah, quite useful.
But the reality is, children and young people are looking at these debates and trying to decide, is this something I want to be in? And we have to be very clear about what these policies that we're anticipating are going to mean to them.
I do want to get into a question about language and how we talk about these issues in a minute, because I think people understanding them is the first step to change happening. Jürgen, I wanted to ask you, in the absence of an internationally agreed system of carbon trading, in the absence, in other words, of a carbon price, what's the market going to come up with?
Well, at the end of the day, I think I mean, if you look in the energy business, for example, that is the most, I think the most recent demonstration. What you see is through shale gas. There is a very cheap U.S. coal available for European power plants, and so the Europeans actually now can only make money if they run their coal power plants as opposed to their gas power plants. And that is a more carbon-intensive way to produce power, and therefore the European emissions actually increase as opposed to decrease. And that can only happen because there is no penalty on the amount of emissions. So that is the way how markets respond, and therefore I think it's absolutely crucial that one has a price for carbon on a global basis to not allow those kind of effects.
I suppose my question is, can we get a price without there being an international agreement?
Yeah, well, we have one. I mean, we have a variety of prices, right? And you just we needn't depend upon a single multilateral, world-sorted-out agreement in order to get a value for carbon established in a variety of ways. You can see it right here in North America today. Mexico has a carbon tax. It has a tradable element attached to it to reduce the cost to covers 80% of the economy. California has a carbon pricing mechanism. So Washington has just agreed to go the same way. British Columbia has one too, and so does Quebec. And they're all finding ways of connecting to each other. The European Union is just about to reset its carbon market sometime during the course of this year to make up for the fact that it has, you know, failed institutionally to keep a price at a meaningful level. And sure enough, whoever thinks it's a good idea to invest in coal is going to get a surprise, right? Because that price will come. Right? It's a short-term play, not a long-term play, in my view. But we haven't given up on valuing carbon globally. And even if we don't get some magic agreement in 2015, I'm quite optimistic about the climate agreement in 2015, I guarantee you many parts of the world, China being a very good example today, will establish their own tailor-made carbon valuation systems, and I hope they extend them to things like soil. I hope they make it attractive to farmers to pursue conservation strategies. I hope they make soil scientists and hydrologists as valuable as bankers. That would be a great breakthrough.
Oh, I obviously have a terrible sense of time. I thought we were about halfway through. I had some devastating questions. You'll just have to take the trust on that one, because I apparently don't have time to ask any of them. About 2 minutes ago, I was told there was 1 minute left. But I'd just like to thank all of you for a really interesting and very educational range of views, and hope to do this with you again sometime.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
According to the United Nations, desertification affects 850 million people around the world. Africa could lose 2/3 of its arable land by 2030. In Senegal, 150 square miles of forested area is lost to desertification every year. Ali Matu Baji is trying to fight this problem one garden at a time. She uses a specific planting pattern that can enrich the soil while at the same time provide a new wind barrier.
On a associé l'arboriculture et le maraîchage. Comme par exemple le lesana qu'on est en train de planter comme ça là. C'est un arbre fertilisant. C'est un arbre qui est bon pour l'alimentation du bétail, mais aussi c'est bon pour avoir le bois de chèvre.
Ali Matu manages the garden project for Aprofez, a local women's collective backed by the Spanish NGO Arepas. She has already trained more than 600 women in 12 different villages.
On initie les femmes à faire l'horticulture, c'est pour avoir la sécurité alimentaire, être autonome à l'alimentation, mais aussi être autonome financièrement, parce qu'on ne peut pas tout manger, mais on peut vendre d'une partie et régler d'autres problèmes.
It costs $40,000 US to make each garden. The money goes to building a well to provide year-round irrigation, a fence to keep animals at bay, and training sessions to educate the farmers. Now, Ali Matu wants to expand and build more gardens next to the existing ones.
To use the English language a little unusually, that was going to whet your appetite on the next subject. And that, of course, is on the issue of water stress. It was Leonardo da Vinci who said many years ago, water is the driving force of nature. And it certainly is a big part of the driving force of agriculture. And this panel is an important panel on water stresses and global food security and what we can do about it. And it's chaired by our colleague, former Secretary of Agriculture, former Director of UNICEF, Ann Veneman. And I welcome Ann and her panel up here.
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for bearing with us all day. Thank you, Dan, for that introduction. He was my immediate predecessor and left me lots of goodies in the drawer. But we are here really to discuss an issue that's been coming up over and over again today in these panels, and that is the issue of water. Water is essential for life. It's essential for agriculture. It's one of the biggest challenges our food system faces. As you heard this morning, agriculture accounts for about 70% of freshwater withdrawals around the globe. And, you know, we have competing demands with a growing population from human use, energy, as more and more people around the world get access to energy, and as water resources will have to be better managed, particularly in agriculture, We heard that specific message today from Bill Riley, who said that management of water must be vastly more efficient. So to discuss all of this today, we have a terrific panel. I'm going to introduce them in alphabetical order, not necessarily the order they're up here. We have Jessica Edelman, who is the Senior Vice President and Head of Corporate Affairs of North America for Syngenta. Lester Brown, who's the President of the Earth Policy Institute and the author of more than 50 books, I think. And we discovered last night, sitting next to each other at dinner, that we both had early in our lives worked for the Foreign Agricultural Service. Ronnie Green, he is the Vice President of Agriculture and Natural Resources and the Harlan Vice Chancellor for the Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources at the University of Nebraska. Eiji Kawamura is the Chair of Solutions from the Land Dialogue and one of my successors as Secretary of Food and Ag in the state of California. And Herbert Oberhansley, who's the Chief Economist at Nestle, based in Switzerland. So I'm going to begin with you, Herbert, to give us a bit of an overview of water. This has been an area of focus for you, and I know that Nestle has been very involved in the World Economic Forum work on water, looking at the issues of water, establishing the new center at the World Bank. Give us an overview of the global water situation and what it means for food security.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you to Chicago Council for inviting me. Fascinating day up to now. So what's the situation in water? Let me take a look back first, starting 1900. 600 cubic kilometer of water withdrawn. And already then, as Anne said, some 70% for agriculture. It increased to 1,400 cubic kilometers in 1950. In 2010, we were at 4,500 cubic kilometers. Now, it's a measure that won't tell you a lot. If I would transform it in liters, it would tell you even more, even less, because there are so many zeros. But let's compare to available water. And that's kind of a difficult concept. Water availability, you have to understand, water must be here in the right form, at the right time, at the right place. Doesn't help a lot if there is more than enough water from rain in Switzerland when there is lack of water in the Sahara. Doesn't help that much when there is a lot of water coming down during 2 months of monsoon in the same region of India, when then the water is lacking, when farms have to grow their plants. When you take all that, you get to 4,200 cubic kilometers of water that is sustainably available. And I said withdrawal are already at 4,500 cubic kilometers. Where do these 300 cubic kilometers come from? It's basically they are withdrawn from nature. You may have seen maps or even pictures of Aral Sea, of Lake Chad, all mostly because of overuse of by agriculture in the affluents, drying up Lake Aral now maybe 15% of the original surface. It's what you don't see, and what is even worse, it's the overuse of underground, often fossil water. Here in the US, Ogallala Aquifer, there are estimates that about half of the water that was accumulated after the last ice age has been used. 250 cubic kilometers. That's for one region already almost the whole gap that you have every year. This water will be needed in case of drought, because usually you would not use that water in a period when you have enough rain, but you would use it, this underground water, when you really are in a difficult situation. But it's not the case. It has been systematically used. What is the outlook? If we don't change the way we are using water today, the forecast, the scenario of this World Economic Forum group is that it will increase to 6,900 cubic kilometers in the year 2030, 60% more than is sustainably available. Nature will no longer be enough to cover that gap. So the user that is using, or the user that is withdrawing most of the water will probably be the one that also suffers most. And the scenario that we see is a 30% shortfall in cereal production due to a water shortage by 2025, 2030. It's a scenario, as I said, if there is no change. But it's so dramatic that I think action would be very urgent, and hopefully that after this session here also, awareness that action is necessary will increase.
Well, that's a bit of a depressing scenario. So let's go on to Lester Brown, who's written for many years about the issues of environment, of food security. Talk about how water fits into this equation and what you see in the future.
Worldwide, at the moment, water shortages are probably the principal constraint on efforts to expand world food production. There's a lot of land out there that could produce food if we had the water to go with it. So water is emerging as the front and center issue. We forget how much water it takes to produce food. We drink, on average, maybe 5 liters a day, 4 liters a day. But the food we eat each day requires 2,000 liters to produce, or 500 times as much. So we can visualize this water we drink, but it's not so easy to visualize the amount it takes to produce our food each day. So the growth in world population, rising affluence, all are putting more pressure on water supplies. One of the consequences is that we've long ago outrun the supply of surface water from rivers and building dams and so forth. Around 1950, 1960 maybe, the emphasis shifted to drilling for underground water. So we've been doing that now for some time and doing it on a scale that's leading to aquifer depletion. You mentioned the Ogallala, that happens to be a fossil aquifer. The deep aquifer under the North China Plain is also a fossil aquifer. It is being overpumped. When it's gone, it's gone. They'll go back to dryland farming. In thinking about the things we can do in response to a tightening water supply, one of them is in affluent societies, we can move down the food chain. We're living too high on the food chain for our own good to begin with as a society, at least in this country. Moving down the food chain not only reduces the demand for grain to produce livestock products, it also reduces the demand for water. So this is kind of a win-win situation. If we're eating too much meat, milk, and eggs, if we reduce that, that's the quickest way we as individuals can actually make a difference on the water balance. With irrigation systems, we have the possibility for more efficient use of water. We've evolved irrigation systems that were convenient and relatively easy, but not necessarily that we're the most water efficient. So I think we're going to have to do some rethinking here. We have flood irrigation, which takes a lot of water, obviously, and is frequently used with rice production. We have furrow irrigation, then we have sprinkler irrigation, and drip irrigation. And each of those is progressively more efficient in the use of water. We can think about more water-efficient crops. For example, it takes roughly 1,000 tons of water to produce 1 ton of wheat, but 2,000 tons of water to produce 1 ton of rice. Now, there's some places in the world where you don't really have an option, but there are large areas like North Africa and the Middle East, where Egypt, for example, is growing a lot of rice, but it doesn't have enough water to produce the wheat it needs. So in Egypt, reducing rice consumption, reducing rice production, and increasing wheat production would actually lead to a much larger grain harvest with the same supply of water. We are now seeing for the first time in history the decline in grain production in the Arab Middle East as a result of a shrinking water supply. Aquifers in Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Iraq, Syria are all being overpumped. And as a result, this part of the world has already experienced peak water. Peak water is now history. And the interesting thing is if you chart peak water and then peak grain, they're only a few years apart. And so grain production in that region of the world has now dropped 20, maybe 30% over the last several years because the aquifers are being depleted and the irrigated area is shrinking. So this is no longer hypothetical. We already have one region of the world, albeit a relatively small one, where grain production is declining as a result of a shrinking water supply. We need to think about, I think I mentioned rice versus wheat. We need to think about upland rice, for example. There's not a lot of research on upland rice, but it is clearly a possibility. And I think we need to take inventory of our agricultural research efforts around the world and see to what extent they deal directly or indirectly with the water issue, and then begin to, in some cases, reshape the pattern of investment in agricultural research in order to help us use water more efficiently.
Great. Thank you so much. Just getting back to the Middle East importing more grain and growing less. I was in California just last week at meeting with a small seed company that has exported a lot of alfalfa seed to Saudi Arabia. That's their largest market, bigger even than the US for this seed. And they said that seed exports are going down and the hay exports are going up because they want the finished product. They're basically importing the water. So now I want to move on to talking about California. As was already stated in this symposium today, California is suffering the worst drought in recorded history. Just this week, on Monday, a report came out from the University of California at Davis, which looked at the impacts of the drought on California's Central Valley. That's where my home area is, where I grew up on a farm. And they have estimated that the costs in lost crops and other economic impacts is $1.7 billion. This is in the Central Valley. More than 14,000 workers will lose their jobs, and 300,000 acres of farmland have been fallowed because of lack of water. One of the things I heard also when I've been out there is that many of these farmers are not farming their row crops because they are taking their overall water allocation and using it for their tree nuts primarily. The increase in production of almonds, walnuts, and pistachios has been growing exponentially in California. And of course, they need to keep these trees alive. So water decisions are being made in this drought area, and it's reducing the amount of farmland that's going to be actually farmed this year. Eiji Kawamura, who farms in California, not in the Central Valley, but he's been personally affected by the situation. Talk a little bit about what's going on and what do you think some of the solutions are?
It's amazing that in ours, can we hear it?
No.
It's amazing how quickly we can get in trouble as a large agricultural state. We had a chance in 2008 to go down and visit Australia in year 11 of their 12-year drought. At that time, in year 8, they had already seen their rice production, wheat production almost completely collapse. In fact, we heard with some dismay that they had a 50% drop in farm gate in those later years. Can you imagine a 50% drop in farm gate? Is this working now? 50% drop in farm gate in any other region of the planet. These are the challenges we face. And one of the issues that we wanted to talk about in my own operation, I'm a fruit and vegetable grower, and I'm an irrigator. I turn water on and off, and if it's dry, I turn more water off. If it's wet, I don't have to put much water out. Just 2 weeks ago, we went through one of the hottest dry spells with Santa Ana winds that I've ever been through in May, both combined at the same time. And in any normal crop, if I had been a rain-fed farmer, I would have lost that crop. In fact, I'm farming on some old dry lima bean ground, dry farming lima bean ground, and we have a great crop with a new variety that's pretty well heat resistant. And I'm going to, instead of maybe having a 50–60% loss, I'm going to actually harvest maybe close to 85+% out of this crop that I would have lost in a different scenario. We talk about how this world will need to feed itself, but I as a fruit and vegetable grower that irrigates, I think what's amazing to me is, if the numbers are still correct, over 92–94% of all of Africa is rain-fed agriculture. Over 80% in our own Midwest of our agriculture is rain-fed agriculture. If you go to Australia, I think the numbers are still around 90% of the agriculture in Australia is rain-fed agriculture. And so trying to create predictability in this outcome of growing things are two different things when you're talking to a farmer that irrigates. We are always investing, all farmers will invest in things that create more predictability in the outcome of our endeavors. And in the case of an irrigator, we'll invest in pumps, we'll invest in, as Lester said, we were one of the last in our county to go from furrow irrigation to sprinklers, from sprinklers to drip irrigation. And now we're actually looking very hard at hydroponics, which also, over and above drip irrigation, will save you another 50, 60, 70% less water per square foot per productive unit. And we look at these things because we're in a business to try and stay in a very urban area. I'm an edible landscaper. People laugh about that, but we lease all the ground that we farm on. In my area, I have 4 different water sources, 2 different water districts with reclaimed water. One, I'm using actually potable water, only because we can't get that line reclaimed in yet. And then we have a couple of pieces where we have well water. This year, one of the impacts that we did see immediately this spring was we started to see high salts start to build up, and that's something we haven't talked about today, and not many people are talking about that. But as water scarcity continues to grow, you see the salts coming up, and you only have a few things you can do. You can buffer your water. Dilution is the solution people are always talking about, is trying to find clean water, and at the same time you can look for salt tolerant and drought tolerant plants. And so one of the challenges I think we're all facing in our ability to stay in business is, what are the tools, what's in the toolbox for us as we move forward? And a development of infrastructure, I think, is as important as anything. We have to commit to looking at the future. California, a long time ago, built with visionary leaders a future that we could grow into. Now we're at the point of time where if we don't do that again very soon, we're going to have a train wreck. In fact, we all kind of know that, but we're kind of wavering between pretending ignorance and actually negligence in our state. And so we hope we can build out this next half century's worth of infrastructure very soon with a vote of the public. And actually, that's one of the areas that we're facing today.
Well, that leads into the next issue. If we need a toolbox, we've talked a lot today about technology. Dr. Green, what are the highest research priorities? What are some of the most promising things on the horizon? We've actually seen a lot of things today already. But what do you see from your position in a major land-grant research university?
Well, first of all, I guess I would also want to add my thanks for being able to be here today and be part of this very important discussion. Congratulations to the Chicago Council on putting these two subjects in the same bucket. They needed to be there, and congratulations on doing that in this forum. I want to provide a little bit of context up front. I think it will help you understand. My friend Howard did this morning as well. I come from a place that is a nexus of water and a nexus of scarcity of water. The Ogallala Aquifer has already been mentioned by one of the previous panelists, and the concerns about that groundwater resource. Our state actually sits over the vast majority of the Ogallala Aquifer and the water in that aquifer. And we also happen to be a place that is primarily dependent on agriculture. We're the largest red meat producing state in the United States, consistently one of the top 2 or 3 in crop production in major crops. So water, you can see, is of obvious importance to us. This morning I thought it was interesting. There was a little bit of discussion about belief in climate change. I forget exactly how the statement was made. I won't get into the conservative liberal label that one of my friends mentioned this morning, but there was reference made to whether farmers in the Midwest of the United States believe that climate variability, weather volatility, climate change is important and real. I can assure you they do. They do believe that it is real. They do believe that it is important, so much so that they encouraged us at our land-grant university this last 2 years to significantly increase our faculty in agriculture and natural resources related specifically to water. Now, to the specific of the question around research priorities, we also heard a lot this morning and earlier today about how much technology we already have and how many things are already sitting on the shelf or in the toolbox, so to speak, if they could be effectively deployed economically and in a context that makes sense for them. We've made huge progress over the last number of decades in our productivity and use of water and the efficiency of that use of water. With that said, however, the innovation that needs to occur to address the issues we've been hearing about water scarcity from the panel needs to be ramped up considerably from what it has been in more recent years. We heard a lot about abiotic stress this morning and development of plant varieties that break the heat tolerance threshold. We heard a lot about salinity this morning, so continuing to invest resources in identifying germplasm that is resilient under these abiotic stressors is of critical and key importance, particularly around water use efficiency in those systems. One thing that's not been discussed a lot today is water use in the processing industry and the importance of focusing not just on the production sector itself, in the field, so to speak, or on the ranch, so to speak, but also in that actual processing part of the supply chain and water use that goes into that final product, and how are we going to make that more efficient? How are we going to make it more sustainable long term? And then lastly, I guess I would close with research not in the biological spheres, so to speak, but research in what we heard the previous panel talk about in terms of social innovation and institutional change. Water evaluation, if you live in Nebraska, is a big deal. And it currently is not well understood. And it's currently not valued in the way that perhaps we expect that it will need to be long-term for our production systems. We're certainly not unique in that case, where research in social innovation and the human dimensions of water use and valuation needs to be put up as paramount in importance as well. And I'll stop there, Ann.
All very important issues, and I want to get back to some of those issues when we take up the second round. Now we move on to Jessica Adelman. One of the things that Syngenta has implemented is a, quote, good growth plan, which involves increasing productivity by 20% without using more land, water, or inputs. So talk to us about this. It sounds like a very great initiative that your company has engaged in, and tell us what you're doing with reducing the land, water, and inputs and more productivity.
Great. Thank you, Secretary Veneman. I'm delighted to talk to you all about the Good Growth Plan, and I also want to thank my fellow panelists. You're more than just the thorns between the two roses, I guess, here today. So thank you for your points, and all of which are incredibly important when we talk about this crucial topic of water. And look, Syngenta understands, much like everybody who's here today, the importance of being able to feed the planet and do it in a way that's sustainable and going to protect it for the long haul and make sure it's there for the future generations. And when we look at what we want to do with a 20th and 21st century agriculture, We need agriculture to be science smart, climate smart, and people smart. And it's with those principles that we got together and we thought about, well, what can we do? So we're a company that sells inputs. We sell some of those seeds that were talked about this morning. I had the pleasure of sitting at lunch with Howard, and I didn't want to ask him, but I had to, which seeds he used, that his corn sprung back up in 4 days. Very diplomatic. He said a mixture. But in my heart, I know that they were Syngenta seeds. But so thank you for your diplomacy, though. So talking about what it is that we do, we've got these crop inputs. They're seeds and also crop protection chemicals. And we know as a company that people don't want more stuff in their food. They want to be able to feel really good about what it is that they eat. And that's what caused us to go back to the drawing board and think about what is our role as a company that wants to engage responsibly as society. And that's where we came up with the Good Growth Plan. And it's very specific. I like to think of it as the concept of 1 planet, 6 commitments. And it's one of the most comprehensive, ambitious programs that's been put out there for agriculture. And in a nutshell, there's 6 key topics, 6 commitments. 1 is to make crops more efficient, like the Secretary just pointed out. And we are going to increase the productivity of the world's major crops by 20%, okay? And we're going to do it without using more inputs. Now, for a major inputs company to stand up and say that, that's risky. That puts us out there. But we understand. We've heard what it is that society does and doesn't want from their agriculture. The second point is we're going to rescue more farmland. And we're going to bring 10 million hectares back from the brink of degradation. That's a commitment we're making around the world. We're also going to help biodiversity flourish. We're going to take the biodiversity on 5 million hectares of farmlands. Now, embedded in this is the topic of pollinators. That actually hasn't come up today as much as I thought it might. What are we doing for bee health and these important other species that are part of the biodiversity equation that make agriculture so popular? We were talking about some of the tree nuts and the almond crop in California, and these pollinators are essential. And so built into these commitments are definitely working with pollinators. We're going to empower smallholders. I loved it when we heard at lunch about the smallholder farmer, and I'm glad that that's such a focus of our conversations here today. Our plan is to reach 20 million smallholders and enable them to increase their productivity by 50%. 20 million people raising their productivity by 50%. We hope that that's going to make a real impact in food security. Also, helping people to stay safe. We're going to train 20 million farm workers on safe labor practices. That applies here in the United States with kids and people who help out their families on the farm, as well as those girls in Africa who help out with the weeding and hopefully get to go to school too, thanks to some of the wonderful programs that have been put into place through some of our World Food Prize winners. And then finally, looking after every worker. We're going to make sure to look after the labor conditions in all of the supply chains in which we're a part of. Now, this one was a topic we discussed and debated hotly within our organization, and we thought, well, let's just commit to taking care of our own facilities and our own fields. But we thought, we have to think bigger than that, and we have to make sure that the standards that we would want on our own farms and on our own facilities, we make imperative for those that we deal with in our value chain. So these are our 6 commitments for our 1 planet, and we're going to try to reach them by 2020. So we know it's not going to be easy. The adage in our digital world that if you can't measure it, it didn't happen. We understand that. So we're going to make sure that we work with NGOs and third parties to track what it is that we're doing. And we have these global reference farms that are going to help us stay on top of what it is that we are committing to and help us to measure our progress. So it's ambitious, but we think we can do it with your help.
That's terrific. One of the comments that was made this morning is there was a reference made to creating shared value, which is really a concept that's being adopted by more and more companies. It's a concept that's particularly been embraced, I think, by a lot of the food and ag companies. And really, how do you build value for shareholders and value for society? And I think that this Syngenta initiative shows a very strong creating shared value concept in building that kind of shared value of society and shareholders. Nestle, of course, has been a real leader also in the Creating Shared Value initiative with Harvard and so forth. And Nestle has 3 pillars, one of which is water. Mm-hmm. Let's talk a little bit about what you're doing in trying to address the water issues as you build shareholder value and value for society.
Quickly before the 2 other pillars, one is nutrition. The second one is rural development. I think my colleague who's involved there would be also interesting to listen to in the context of these different meetings. But the third, or not the third one, but equally important, is water. What does it include? It is the responsibility, the activity of the company. And it was just mentioned, of course, we have to start with our own activities, with our own operations. We have brought water withdrawals down from 4.5 liters per US dollar of sales 10 years ago to less than 1.5 liters. And that's relatively small. I think we should be one of the leaders in the food industry. Clearly, when you compare to other sectors, for instance, pulp and paper, with several hundred liters per US dollar of sales, this is not big anymore. But still, we do a maximum. We work with the farmers. There can be more water efficiency, like you outlined, Lester. There can also be the transformation of manure in so-called biodigesters into some gas for household cooking, and then the dry fertilizer, because you have also to see the second part of water use, the wastewater disposal. We do then projects where we help with drilling wells, because our interest in water is, of course, starts with the water for agriculture, but then we have a lot of products that need safe water to be prepared. Soups, sauces, spices, also milk powder. So we are in water along the milk the value chain, along the usage chain of the food, because it's in our interest. But then comes in a factor where we have to be modest. We are by far the biggest food company in the world, and that sounds very big. But then you compare with the total market. The total market is about 10% of world GDP, which means that as the biggest, we have some 1.5% market share. And here, whatever we take as initiative, we understand that we need partnership, that we need public-private partnership, and we have to understand at what level that we are acting. As part of this, our chairman has initiated the 2030 Water Resources Group. It is now hosted here at IFC in the World Bank. And here the approach is that we look at watershed by watershed. I mentioned before, there is no global water issue. It is different from watershed, from river basin to river basin. You look what the gap is. You try to understand how big that gap will be in 2030, because you don't want to solve the situation today when you see a dynamic that makes it even worse. And then you look at the levers, how to close the gap in the most effective, in the most cost-effective way. But then it's not a plan that we are setting up. It cannot be a plan of a group of multinational companies or intergovernmental organization to be imposed on people in a river basin, but we ask the government there to use these tools that we propose and set up a strategy to close the gap as soon as possible. And then, of course, again comes in our responsibility. So creating shared value is also understanding where we should be active ourselves, and there are a number of areas, and where we have to be a partner, a loyal partner, under the leadership of others. Because in a watershed, I mentioned the falling water tables. We started the water activity in a watershed in the north of India, in Punjab. Water tables are falling 1 meter per year. And we talked to the farmers, because we have a milk factory there. We are using the milk from these farmers. They said, of course, we know that we are destroying our livelihood. But individual farmers tell you, if I'm not pumping up, the neighbors, the neighboring villages will pump up anyway. So for these farmers, if you don't come with a solution for the whole river basin, the whole watershed, they will tell you, go somewhere else. If you tell them you have to become, you are milk supplier of Nestle, you have to become the most water efficient supplier. They want to have something that really works. So this is our standing of shared value with the different levels, own responsibility, and then the understanding where we have to fit in strategies of others. And as I said, under the leadership of our chairman, who was very involved in that.
Great. I want to move now to follow up on some of the issues that have come up during the discussion today. We've heard several panels refer to the need to price carbon. And in the last panel, we heard again about pricing water and that it's not quite as easy. But I want to ask for the panel's reaction to this whole issue of, should we be managing resources differently? Should we be pricing water differently, given that agriculture uses 70% of fresh water around the world? How should we be addressing this issue? Who wants to start? Lester?
I think I first wrote about pricing carbon in 1993, so it's not a new issue. I've come to think, however, that it's not an issue that I want to spend much time on, and the reason is because I don't think it's going to happen. We're now beginning to see the market beginning to drive the energy transition, for example, from oil and coal to solar and wind. We're seeing this rather dramatically with rooftop solar installations. They have now become cheap enough that in many parts of the country, a rooftop solar installation can provide electricity at a lower cost than the local utility is. And so what's happening is that as more and more rooftop installations go in, the market for the utility begins to shrink. And the utility has to raise its prices, further encouraging more people to invest in their own rooftop installation. So it's become a death spiral for utilities. And it's not just in this country. I think it was RWE in Germany, or I've forgotten which one it was, but they had to write off $3.7 billion last year because their market was shrinking, but they still have to maintain the same customer infrastructure. So we're looking at a situation now where the market is driving massive change. And what it's translating into for utilities is what's become known as the death spiral, because once their market begins to shrink and they start raising prices, then that process just feeds on itself. So I think we're going to see a lot of market-driven change in the transition from fossil fuels to solar and wind energy. Wind is now coming in under natural gas in many parts of this country. China, we haven't heard much about China today. China is building 6 wind mega complexes, each of which will have at least 10,000 megawatts of generating capacity. Think 10 nuclear power plants in each of these complexes. The largest one is being built, it's already under construction in Inner Mongolia. When it is complete, it will have 38,000 megawatts of generating capacity. That's enough to satisfy the needs of a country like Poland. I mean, we're seeing a scaling up with wind energy that we've never seen before in the energy sector. I mean, we've never thought about a 20,000 megawatt nuclear complex or a coal-fired complex. So we're in an extraordinarily dynamic period, and my own sense is that we're going to see 50 years of change squeezed into this next decade, the next 10 years. I think we're going to see change at a pace and on a scale that we've never seen before. I mean, it took a long time to get from wood to coal and coal to oil, but this transition is going to be very fast, and it's going to leave a lot of stranded assets, again on a scale we've not seen before. Coal plants are not worth anything anymore, for example, in some places. So it's going to be an extraordinarily dynamic period in economic terms, and I don't think we've yet quite grasped how fast it's going to happen.
Anybody else want to comment on the pricing of water? Or
yeah, I would like to say that in California there's a great pricing market that exists all the time, and it's really driven by energy, cost of energy pushing water around the states. So where we farm down in Southern California, those agencies that have realized that they may someday not have Colorado River or water coming from north have started to invest in tremendous amount of systems to utilize the water they get when it comes and how it comes, both reclaimed and capturing water. I agree with Lester. The changes that we're seeing, though, are remarkable, because if you look at the problem about water on the planet, it's not that we don't have water on the planet. It's not even that we don't have fresh water. We have salty water. We have a lot of it. We have a lot of water in the atmosphere, and these new technologies driven by passive energy or efficient energy systems are partly what we're starting to see everywhere. I see little membrane reverse osmosis filter systems that are on wheels being wheeled in and out of different greenhouses these days, and suddenly this idea that the California or the U.S. Vine-ripe tomato industry is now 40% hothouses, whether it's in Canada or it's North America actually, or in Arizona. These new systems fuel and utilizing new technologies is creating an enormous change in where we're at. What we don't have is a regulatory system with any imagination allowed it. I think one of the biggest challenges we have is our regulatory systems must be given some ability to create flexibility with how they perceive they need to regulate, because what we're seeing is the early adopters and the early adapters are actually getting shut down or stalled or pushed out of business because they have to cross so many barriers just to get these new technologies into place and up and running. There's no incentivization for new thinking, for new technologies as well. And what we hope to see out of a farm bill or out of any number of energy policies is a continued incentivization for new systems. That old term that was called permaculture in the 50s and 60s, I think that's where we're headed. People are talking about how everybody's going to migrate to these mega cities. Well, if you have a food shed, watershed, energy shed, well adapted, very closed systems that are very efficient, very, very smart in regions around the planet, who wants to migrate to a megacity? You can visit the megacity, but you're going to start to see very nice systems set up where you have all these different things in play. The challenges of waste, which uses a lot of water. We know that within another couple of decades, waste will be a term of the 20th century, and people will laugh and say, oh, we threw away a lot of things in our day. We are not doing it anymore, because why would you when it has so much value? So pricing is things that we value is always there, and when it's scarce, it costs more. When you start creating abundance, whether it's abundance of water or abundance of energy, there's a lot of people that don't want that to happen because their core business is threatened. As we start to see abundance of water created on farm, whether it's atmospheric water harvest, whether it's just circular systems that reuse the water over and over on your own farm, these start to create opportunities, but also some liabilities. So I think what's exciting is we have to, Mark Twain said, if you can't trust your judgment if your imagination is out of focus, right? We have got to allow ourselves to have an imagination of what the 21st century is going to look like, leave that 20th century mentality behind, and embrace some of these great changes that are coming online as fast as we can imagine. So I 100% agree with where Lester is saying. We're seeing so many neat advances in this squeezed, shortened time.
Anybody else on pricing?
Yeah, the only thing I would add is, brought up water evaluation earlier in comments, is relates somewhat to what you were just saying. The incentive that's there today, so if you're a large irrigator and you're pumping groundwater for that irrigation system, the incentive today is largely around energy use, just as you just said. So if there is a way for me to pump less water, or a way for me to get that energy more efficiently to pump that water, that's what's driving the system today. We have this system in Nebraska called the Nebraska Agricultural Water Demonstration Network. It's run by one of our faculty that now has 1,200 farmers in it spread across the state, who are deploying soil moisture sensors to regulate their irrigation system so that they put on less water, when it's needed, time right, water smart approaches. Sounds simple, sounds common sense, but not that easy to deploy in a dispersed industry where people are just pumping water out of the aquifer. So the incentives today are largely around energy. I would agree with both what both speakers have said.
Did you want to
Yeah, I think one has to distinguish two components in what the water price might be. One part is what you somehow mentioned is the infrastructure, is the energy cost. But then there is a value of the water per se. And one of the best examples that I know is coming from Oman. That's the very southeast of the Saudi Arabian Peninsula. Just to say before, it's a system that has been working for 4,500 years, so it is sustainable. That's about the best proof. What did they do? They first built, it's the village that builds the irrigation structure that finds water in the mountains, leads it in tunnel to the village. Then first it's free water for drinking, also for people who are passing by, free water for the mosque, for the washing, for the ceremonial washing there. And then it becomes private property, and this private property is tradable among farmers. So if one farmer during a month or so doesn't need his water, he sells it to another farmer. If he has an idea to invest in more efficient irrigation, he sells it permanently and finances his own new irrigation scheme. And I've never seen an area where water has been used so efficiently. And I can tell you it's tough to use or to find water there. They produce among the highest value dates that I know. So it is something, you are absolutely right, something that works. Not the price that is imposed from the outside by the government, but is found by the farmers. And also very important, a price that fluctuates over time. When you look at this price within the same watershed, it fluctuates in an order of magnitude 1 to 12. Because during one part of the season, the water is much less value. Water during the night has a different value than water during the day. And this is done by the farmers among themselves. Doesn't need government. That's a fascinating thing.
Moving on to another issue that we've heard a lot about over the course of the discussion today, and that is smallholder farmers. Mm-hmm. And the fact that they produce a significant amount of the world's food. And if they had even basic systems of irrigation and other technologies, we could increase that production significantly and help to address the need to produce so much more food as we approach the middle of this century. So talk a little bit about, Jessica, you mentioned today smallholder farmers in the initiative of Syngenta. Why don't you start us off with it? And I'd like to hear anybody's thoughts on what do you think can be done in this space around the smallholder farmers?
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, I'll actually build on the last set of conversations we were having with water and valuation as a segue into this. And, you know, we talk a lot about the value of water, and I think sometimes we mistakenly only talk about what is the market value or market price of water. I mean, maybe one day in our lifetime we'll see something like a world water exchange. Who knows? It could be just around the corner. What I think is interesting to look at, and this is where it segues into the smallholder farmer, is the idea of the hidden costs of water. And I just was, cruising my Facebook last night, and a friend of mine had posted this really interesting new technology. You mentioned irrigation technologies. So this is called a water wheel. And maybe you all have heard of it, but it's a little hand-pushed item that has a wheel that carries 50 liters of water versus the average 5 liters that women in sub-Saharan Africa and other developing countries are used to transporting on average here and there to be able to do what it is that they need to do as smallholders and to feed their families. And the statistics there were that 200 million hours a day is spent fetching water. Now think about if you could harness that intellectual capital and use it differently, rather than trudging from point A to point B, moving water. What would that look like? And last night we had a wonderful quote Pamela Anderson from the Gates Foundation gave us, where she said she had 3 words when it came to smallholders and agriculture. And the 3 words were women and girls. And I told her I was going to steal that, and I went ahead, I asked permission, and she said, go ahead. But I really think that that is so much of the answer, and I'm so pleased that it's been coming up repeatedly today. Because look, if we had those 200 million hours back, the average person, I guess, spends 35 hours a week moving water in this capacity. Now that's almost a work week. It's almost 2 work weeks in some regions of the world. But this is how we could take this underutilized capacity and this intellectual capital and redeploy it. So that's one example on a very, very small level of irrigation technologies. Syngenta, we deal on that level, and then we deal on the very large level. We have a technology that we use here in the States. It's a system. It's called the Water Plus Intelligent Irrigation Platform, where we use the abiotic stress seeds, the drought-resistant seeds, plus crop protection inputs, plus agronomy, but then also the actual applicators, the water systems. And we use pivots. So you can actually be on your cell phone, your smartphone, be at your kid's soccer game, or be at the grocery store shopping the aisles, and actually change your pivot from row 6 to row 7. Now, that's a pretty futuristic view. And so dealing with things on that level, where we have macro economies where we feed the world, such as the productivity of the US farmer, but then being able to take that down to the level of the smallholder farmer and translate that type of intellectual capital in itself into results that are going to make people successful and productive.
Others want to comment on the smallholder.
I love saying this because I'm a fruit and vegetable grower, but man cannot live on bread alone. He needs fruits and veggies and other things to eat. And when you see the amount of production that can come off of a small piece of ground in terms of tonnage per acre when you're growing fruits and veggies, and if you have a chance, going back to irrigated agriculture, to get second crop off in a year, these are huge numbers. The marketplace for fruits and vegetables, you basically, obviously, if they're perishable, you need an infrastructure in place to bring them into a central market. You look at the way California, I'm a little California-centric, I'm sorry, but it's the place where we grew up. But my grandfather was a sharecropper in the LA area, and you looked at that market develop where you had a central terminal market, a farmer's market, if you will, a wholesale market where growers from all over the area could bring their product in. There was some infrastructure early on for transportation infrastructure, for refrigeration. Once you build those, it sets up the marketplace for a lot of small shareholder growers to participate in a very important market that it will exist wherever you're close to any large population area. And so putting those together, you obviously then have to strategize on those pieces, find the location, find the willing partners that can bring that to happen. But pretty quickly, overnight, you find that you can create products, and let's not say overnight, but a quick growing season. You can move into crops that have tremendous more value, and if you've added some amount of irrigation, you've increased at least somewhat the predictability of that outcome, which allows them to have a chance for that. But we can't, not enough time to talk about all the things you need, crop tools, all the rest. But these are certainly exciting times then for how nutrient-dense products can be started to really be brought into a part of the solution set for ending hunger all over.
Lester, did you want to add to that? No. Let's talk a little bit more about some of the promising technologies. And some of these actually get to this nutrition part that you've mentioned, that Lester mentioned, on needing to eat lower down the food chain. Last year at this conference, we had a speaker who was doing 3D printed meat. And one of the parts of this discussion was the fact that it will be much more environmentally sustainable, even though it will be made out of basically meat cells and so forth, but they'll be grown in a petri dish, therefore not using all the water and so forth. Since then, we've seen a lot of discussion about things that are being funded in the Silicon Valley to create animal-like products that are being produced in a laboratory that will replicate the feel and the taste of meat, but will be made from vegetable protein. I think the Gates Foundation is funding some of this research. But there are many technologies that may not be directly related to water, but actually if they became large scale, and this is where some of the research is going now, it would save a lot of environmental and water impact. I didn't know if anybody, maybe Dr. Green, you'd like to comment on some of these sort of...
Well, coming from the cattle state, number one, I guess...
I think you asked the wrong person.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I'm going to take a little different tack, and then you can go back to your original
Go
question.
next, Lester.
One of the things that often is left out of the discussion, I will tell you my bias. I'm a cattle geneticist professionally by background myself. That's what I spent my life doing, is improving cattle genetics. We are also in the age of technology where those industries have huge opportunities to innovate themselves in ways that will make them more environmentally sustainable. Things like, for instance, re-engineering the gut of the rumen. And we can begin to really think about doing that today in a way that we weren't able to do before. So, sorry to get you off track, but I just couldn't miss that opportunity to throw that in.
That's not off track. I did it as sort of, let's look at all the technology that's out there. There are many, many types of things. But Lester, maybe you want to, since you brought up this issue of eating lower down the food chain.
Yeah, what we've seen in this country over the last, I guess, 7 years now is a decline in per capita meat consumption. And that's importantly beef, but even includes poultry. And I think part of this is for health reasons. I think we realize we're eating a lot of meat and fatty products in our diet. I also notice that young people have a different set of food values than our generation has. They're much more vegetable oriented, less meat oriented. I mean, for my generation, if you had gotten a promotion or something and wanted to celebrate, you went out and had a steak dinner. I mean, that was a given, It was, but young people don't think in those terms.
Now they go out and eat a quinoa dinner.
Right. Quinoa was the word.
It's a joke.
So we're seeing a cultural shift here that I think has the effect of, over time, moving us down the food chain, which is probably, which is good for us and also, I think, good for the planet. And it also frees up some land and water resources to raise consumption in parts of the world that very much need more consumption.
I think this is a great question. If you look at disruptive technologies, and some of the really interesting ones that got my attention lately is the idea, can we produce animal feed in the Petri dish? I mean, because if you look at so much of what row crops and large production agriculture goes to fuel, it's the animal feed industry. So this is where you get the compound effects that take so many of our inputs and put them to use. So that was one that I thought was really interesting. I'm in the middle of reading this great piece in this week, I believe it is, this week's New Yorker, on the Soylent, which is a Silicon Valley entrepreneur type, decided that food was sort of, just kind of a bother, frankly. He wanted to be coding or something at his computer constantly, and he basically put together a sludgy cocktail of amino acids and other ingredients that he's been living on for 1.5 years, so I guess it works. But I think it takes away a little bit of the joy of living, but I guess if you're just coding away and only keep up with your friends on Facebook and you don't need to go to a meal, it works for Silicon Valley. So that was one that I thought was really interesting. And then I think the other ones that come into play tend to be around changing just the patterns and what are the social norms about going out and eating and what do people eat. So it's a great topic. It's one that could radically change the face of this industry. Now, that said, people have a very strong emotional relationship to their food as well. And are you going to, does everybody want to drink a sludgy mixture over a computer every night and every morning and every day at lunch? Probably not. But the more we start thinking about where could some of these macro disruptions and interesting new technologies and thinking completely differently about how we're going to feed the 9 billion come into play, I think it's great. And look, I love a steak just as much as the next person, but I was thinking a lot about what Lester said as we head out into Memorial Day weekend. And frankly, your hamburger that you might have this weekend is 2,400 liters of water. Now, that's probably more water than the pool you're going to swim in this weekend, not the ocean you'll go to for the beach. But these are things that, until we start understanding the different ratios out there, that 1 liter goes to 1 calorie of food. And that's a pretty big number, frankly, if you start adding that up. So it starts with us, and it starts with governments, it starts with individuals and society, and it starts with companies like Syngenta and our Good Growth Plan. And so it's really an interesting time.
Did you want to comment?
Yeah, I think we have to think about the consumer as well, and you mentioned it. Food is somewhat emotional. First, reducing meat in our areas, be it US, be it Europe, be it some other areas, that's an urgent thing. It's for the health, it's for the environment, it's a no-brainer.
It's a win-win.
It's a win-win. But at the same time, we should remember that in developing countries, meat consumption is still very low. They may be in the 50, 60, or 70 grams per day. US, New Zealand, France, they are in the 400 grams, just that you have a relation. So you cannot expect people in the developing countries to stay with a bowl of rice per day. They have the right to ask for some chicken, maybe even for some beef from time to time. By no means should they go up to the average that we have in the West. That's very clear. But this increase will continue, and this increase, even if it's modest, it's usually 1 or 2 grams per day in average, by the large number of people has much more weight than what we are reducing. So we should expect that there still an increase is taking place. That's why we came with the estimate to this 6,800, 6,900 cubic kilometers. On the specific point that you mentioned, we did a number of research projects. For instance, in the 1960s, 70s, we tried to transform fuel into food. And today it goes the other way around, which would also be a subject to be discussed here, but probably leave it out. But transforming, producing proteins out of petrol. And it was something that works very well. We also try to create some artificial meat based on soy. But the consumer doesn't like it. Consumer feels that, and we are good in marketing. Don't underestimate our marketing. It's not, look, one has to be realistic. As soon as there is the impression of, in German the word is Ersatz, replacement, they don't want it. So, of course, we will make other efforts, especially soy-based products. In the case of milk, combining milk with soy, there are a lot of opportunities, and we will continue to push for it. But one should accept some emotions and some gut feelings on the consumer side. It's the reality out there, and it's good the idea that we have at Nestle and our engineers have, and not all of them fly.
Okay, we're running out of time, and so because Secretary Vilsack's on his way, I just got a note. So, AG, I'm going to let you comment on this question, and then I want each of you in one sentence to say, with regard to addressing the water issue and food, what would be the one thing you say is most important to address? So let's...
And I'll link my question, that question with my answer here, is that currently we're seeing reclaimed water systems all over the world and all over the country. One of the great systems that's taking place is they're using, in our waste management system nearby, they have a waste system digester that's then splitting off the methane coming out of the human waste digester and running fuel cells to help running the plant, which then is cleaning up the water with a tertiary treatment. And if you add the ultraviolet light to this system, actually you end up with potable water that's fully drinkable. And so what we're seeing is, as a new sources of water on the planet, if countries are going to build sewer systems, if they go down that path as opposed to dry systems, which is another conversation for another day, but if they're building or they already have these systems in place, this idea that we're not going to have waste on the planet anymore, that needs to be ramped up. That can be ramped up in whether it's systems for digesters for waste food that can digest and give you some great compost, and they're run passively or not. These are the exciting things that are taking place. So taking waste, creating new water based out of water that you previously were throwing away, that's an immediate source for folks that might want to be smallholders, shareholders that might want to grow around an urban area or in that urban forest and grow great products.
Great. Jessica.
Okay, hashtag global ag. Something needs to change. It's time to rethink hashtag water.
Right. Ronnie Green.
Water is the new oil, is the way I would say it, first of all. And secondly, I think we heard it clearly this morning. Might surprise you that based on the discussion that I'm going to say this, but we have to address the water lost in food waste in the system.
Herbert?
There is a comparison between water withdrawals for agriculture and the physiological need of plants. The water withdrawals are 250% of the physiological needs. So there is enough room to save water to solve this problem that we see coming.
And Lester, I'm giving you the last word.
We talked about photosynthesis. It is the most efficient technology we have for converting water and CO2 into edible products. On the water issue, the most important thing we can do if we want to save water is to move down the food chain, simply because 80% of all the water we use is for irrigation.
Well, I want to thank this terrific panel. I think it's been a great discussion. I want to thank the audience for listening. And we will now turn the podium back over to Dan Glickman. No, he's not here yet.
California suffered a historic drought in the first half of 2014. As a result, the water that farms normally brought in from far-off reservoirs became scarce and expensive, and farmers are forced to fallow their fields.
We fallow about 50% of our ground this year, so that automatic cut 50% of our crew. I feel bad about it because I had guys working for me for the last 10, 15 years, and we had to let them go because there's no work, you know.
Part of the solution could be right underneath these farmers' fields. Beneath all this dry dirt, there is actually water, lots of it. Several feet underground, there's a layer of clay that catches rainwater and agricultural runoff. Over the years, a huge reservoir of water has built up underground. The problem is, it's too salty to use. Entrepreneur Aaron Mendel understands this problem well. Mendel started WaterFX. The company has built a small, solar-powered desalination plant. It pumps underground water through these pipes to remove the salt and make it reusable for agriculture.
When the sun rises, we have basically a giant mirror that concentrates the energy from the sun. So just like a magnifying glass, we concentrate the energy, we generate heat, and we use the heat to evaporate fresh water. So the dirty water comes in, it contacts the steam that we generate from the solar energy, and we distill off fresh water, leaving all of the salt behind. It's a very basic process, but we're running it with renewable energy.
The local water utility sponsored this desalination plant as part of a pilot project. They want water security for the dry years to come. WaterFX is planning to build more solar arrays by 2015. In the end, this technology's success comes down to economics. Making usable water with solar desalination isn't cheap. In wet years, it still costs less for farmers to buy water from reservoirs than from the desalination plant. But if climate change brings more droughts, reservoir water could become prohibitively expensive. and that could make solar desalination an economically attractive solution.
Last year, I introduced Tom Vilsack as the greatest Secretary of Agriculture. Then I said the second greatest Secretary of Agriculture. And then Ann Veneman is here, so I just got to say the third greatest Secretary of Agriculture. But he's an outstanding public servant, from rural development to all sorts of issues, and implementing a new farm bill, gigantic farm bill, former governor of Iowa, a real credit to our country and a credit to agriculture. I present Secretary Tom Vilsack.
Well, I preferred last year's introduction. It is always an honor to be here, and I do want to thank both Secretary Glickman and Secretary Veneman for continuing the fight. They have been very, very good friends and very good counselors to me in my current position, and have been very, in a bipartisan way, focused on a lot of key issues that we still deal with at the department, and certainly appreciate their friendship and certainly their leadership in this organization as well. Putting the focus on a number of key issues relating to global food security, and had a chance to look at the report, and again, another excellent report. I see Catherine Bertini is here, and I would say that probably my first engagement with global food security was to see her honored as a World Food Prize recipient in my home state of Iowa, and that really began my education. And she has also been critically important in making sure that this is an issue that the Department of Agriculture continues to take seriously. So I thought about this, this speech, and I realized I'm the last person between you and the exit. But this is really an important topic, and I want to take a few minutes of your time, if I might. And I was trying to figure out a way to sort of begin to discuss this issue of climate change and its impact on agriculture. And it prompted me to think about my 4-year-old grandson. He was here a couple weeks ago in Washington, D.C., and as most 4-year-olders are, he was a very curious little fella, and he's very interested in dinosaurs. So he was given the opportunity to kind of take a look at the dinosaur exhibit that recently closed down to be renovated, but was sort of fascinated with these large animals. And just this week, we had the discovery in Argentina of this massive dinosaur bone, and I sent that to his dad and suggested maybe he might want to do some more research on dinosaurs. And it occurred to me that there are a lot of us in this world today that sort of take what we have for granted. But when you realize that years and years and years ago, these very, very large animals roamed the earth, and that when the climate changed, they're no longer here. And what we're talking about is the discovery of what remains of them. And I think it is important for us to recognize that we must be serious about climate change in the context of global food security and the capacity of the world to continue to produce enough food in a sustainable way that will allow us as a humankind to continue this great experiment that we're on, this great journey as a humankind that we're on. And no department of the federal government has any more responsibility in this area than the United States Department of Agriculture. And we have engaged on a fairly aggressive effort in the last several years to really look at this issue as it relates to American agriculture and as it relates to global agriculture. And I thought it would be helpful to all of you to know precisely what we have been doing and why we're doing it, so that you can get a sense of how serious we take this issue. You all know that the climate is changing, and you all know and appreciate that it impacts and affects agriculture. More intense weather patterns, longer droughts, more severe storms, more pests, more diseases really does have an impact on productivity, and if we don't get serious about adapting and mitigating, that will just continue, and it will compromise our capacity to meet this ever-increasing need. So within the U.S., we decided first and foremost we have to make sure our house here in the United States is in order. So we have established recently the 7 climate change hubs really designed to take a look at each region of our country in the United States and the agriculture and forestry needs of each region of our country, and determine how and where the climate is impacting productivity and how our producers and growers might be given the tools and the technologies to enable them to adapt and mitigate to the changing climate so that we can continue to be a food secure nation and continue to provide expertise, knowledge, technology to the rest of the world so that we may be globally food secure. So we've done the establishment of these research hubs. They're in the process of doing vulnerability assessments. There's 7 of them. There are also 3 sub-hubs that are looking at very specific aspects in this country. And obviously that information is going to be very, very important. We wanted to equip our producers individually with the capacity to begin thinking about greenhouse gases and climate change and agriculture's role in all of this. And the U.S. agriculture has done a pretty good job relative to the rest of the world in terms of greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture, but there's still work to be done. And so we established what is called the Comet Farm Tool from NRCS, and it allows farmers to gauge and use this tool to adjust and determine precisely how much greenhouse gas impact certain farming practices will have as they consider them, and what conservation practices can be put in place to negate the impact of those greenhouse gas emissions. So equipping them with specific technology and models that they can use on their own individual property. We also have a program called GraceNet, which is designed to identify practices that will embrace the notion of carbon sequestration through agriculture, on the belief that over time we will be creating ecosystem markets where carbon sequestration will potentially be something that a farmer here in this country could market to a regulated industry that is focused on reducing and sequestering carbon. We've also decided to take a look at exactly the impact that this is having on soil across the United States. There are over 6,000 sites where we're now taking samples to make sure that we know precisely the composition of our soil. It's the most massive data collection of soil quality and quantity and condition in the history of our country. We're engaging certain aspects of agriculture in terms of their impact on greenhouse gases, specifically the dairy industry. We are working with them as they try to, throughout their supply chain, reduce greenhouse gases by 20% by the year 2020. And we are investing in using our financial resources to encourage more anaerobic digesters. So we're really trying to get our house in order, really trying to equip our producers with tools to allow them to evaluate their role in all of this and give us the opportunity to encourage sustainability with data, information, technology, and alike. We also want to share what we know, which is why we've launched the Open Data Initiative, 67 action plans to essentially provide and open up the vaults of the research that has been conducted throughout the United States, publicly financed research that we have sort of retained at USDA for a long period of time. We're now opening that up. We're letting the world see it. We're letting the world use it. And we want that to be encouraged. And we are then using that as a launching pad to establish a global data initiative for agriculture and nutrition. It now has 85 member countries and organizations that they too are collaborating with us and opening up data so that these bright, creative young people who can manipulate and use data will be encouraged to take a look at this to determine how best to use this data to give us instructions on how to deal with a changing climate and how to deal with sustainable agriculture. We're even establishing through data.gov applications for individual farmers that they will be able to use on their farms. So this is designed to share the information that we obtain to make sure that we are focused on getting the right results and getting the right information. We also recognize the responsibility that we have as a nation to align ourselves with other nations that are also currently working on various aspects of climate change and its impact on agriculture, which is why several years ago we established the Global Research Alliance. Now has 41 countries working collaboratively together on livestock operations, crop operations, and rice operations to take a look at how we can better utilize the tools we have, the technology, the information we have, and to ensure that we are not duplicating or replicating research that is being conducted in one of the 41 countries. There is limited amount of resources and financial resources dedicated to agricultural research, and we need to use every dollar as efficiently, as effectively as possible. All of that's great, but at the end of the day, we have to do more, which is why we have engaged aggressively in a conversation with the World Bank and other nations to establish what we like to refer to, and they like to refer to, as an Alliance for Climate-Smart Agriculture. It is really an opportunity for us to take this issue of sustainability and figure out precisely how it ought to work, not just in the United States, not just in individual countries, but globally. And by the term sustainability, I don't just necessarily mean focused on environmental sustainability, although that's part of it. We really have to look at the three prongs of sustainability. There is an economic prong, there is a social prong, and there is an environmental prong. On the environmental prong, it is really all about how you do what you do and the impact it has on the environment, what we can do to mitigate, reduce, and potentially eliminate greenhouse gases directed from agriculture. On the societal side, it's about this whole issue of everything ranging from animal welfare to consumers' right to know how products are being produced, and economically, making sure that whatever we come up with is something that is economically sustainable, because at the end of the day, if the bottom line doesn't add up, you're not going to have folks embrace the notion of sustainability. We want them to embrace this. So we're focused on three goals in this alliance. One is obviously to increase productivity in a sustainable way. Two is to make sure that agriculture continues to be resilient to the climate change. And three, how we can indeed, through technology, better techniques, better knowledge across the globe, reduce and in some cases eliminate the greenhouse gases associated with agriculture and forestry. We want this to be evidence-based, we want it to be integrated, and we want it to be results-oriented. And so our hope is that this gets launched in September as world leaders meet to begin the United Nations conversations. We hope that we are able to launch this effort. And it's not just governments, it's farming organizations, it's scientists, it's folks who are keenly interested in all of this. And at the end of it, we'd like to see better forecasting, better crop management, and better livestock outcomes. It's really pretty simple. And we are engaged in this as we should be. So I hope that you can see from this that we're taking this issue seriously. There are two, or at least one other issue that I want to raise, which in agriculture, we have a tendency in this discussion to focus on productivity and the farmer. And that's all well and good, and we should. But I think we must also focus on the consumer, which is why we have initiated a food waste initiative at USDA. When I say 30% of the food that is produced in this country is not used for the purposes for which it is intended, it is indeed wasted. Much of it ends up in our landfills. It's the single largest solid waste component of our landfills. It is a large producer of methane in our landfills. It seems to me that you can't focus on climate change, you can't focus on agriculture and agricultural policy unless you also focus on the issue of food waste. And so we are aligning ourselves with several hundred companies and organizations within the U.S. to begin a conversation with America about this issue of food waste. Can we look at portion sizes? You know, I go to restaurants, as you probably could expect, quite a lot. Not because of the way I look, but just my job. And from time to time, my lovely wife accompanies me. And I made the mistake the other day of being quoted in the New York Times as saying that my wife was relatively small. So I want to correct that publicly. She's small. I said I was relatively large. Okay, I'm large. The point of this is when we go out to eat, she receives the same portion I do. There's no way, in God's green earth, she can eat all the stuff that she's given. And yeah, you can take it home, but you know how that works. So we really need to be conscious of this, because all that ends up in the garbage can. It doesn't have to be. So portion size is important. It's important for consumers to be educated about what it actually means when it says on the container, best by, or sell by, or best used by. It doesn't mean the second after midnight on the date you got to toss it, which is what my son believes. Can't tell you how many eggs he's gotten rid of. We need better education about what those labels actually mean, because there's a great deal of food that gets tossed. We need mechanisms so that when a supplier goes to a restaurant and for whatever reason, whatever he or she's offering that day isn't quite up to the quality standard of that particular restaurant, it doesn't mean that that's no longer usable. There ought to be an application, and I believe there are, and we're developing these, that will allow that distributor to know where within a 2-block, 5-block, 10-block, 5-mile radius there might be a food bank or a community kitchen that could use that food. We need to be thinking about those things. We need to be thinking about how we are able to reuse food in that context, and we also need to be obviously thinking about how we can recycle it. So at USDA today, if you walk down into the back areas of USDA, you'll see garbage cans labeled coffee grounds. We drink a lot of coffee at USDA. And those coffee grounds are being recycled in part in several of our gardens that we are operating at USDA. It's a way of recycling food waste instead of having it go into a landfill. So I think the key here is to focus not just on agricultural's role, as significant and as important as it is, but also on the consumer role. And I think USDA has a unique opportunity and a unique responsibility to do that. And we are blessed by the work of the Chicago Council in terms of the direction that we need to be focused on. You all keep us honest in this process. You point out where we need to do more. And I know that you've had a discussion of risk management, and I know you've had a discussion of trade, so I'm not going to get into those issues. All of those have been raised in the report, and I think adequately so. I wanted to focus today's work on what we're doing relative to climate, because this is a serious issue. And this is a period of time where we can no longer ignore this issue, can no longer assume that it will always be the same, because it is constantly changing. Let me just simply say that our producers in this country are amazing. They are not as fully appreciated as they need to be in terms of their productivity. And they are ready, willing, and able to embrace this change. Some producers in this country are stressed financially because as we become more productive, there's a premium on production, premium on efficiency, a premium on quantity and quality, which makes it sometimes difficult for folks who have middle to small-sized operations, which is why we're creating new opportunities and new markets. Extraordinarily resilient out there in farm country, but we also need to make sure that we balance that capacity of resiliency with the ability to be transformative. And I think our challenge is to make sure that we equip people to take the fear out of transformation, to educate them that in the long run this is going to be in their long-term best interests, financially, socially, and environmentally. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here today and appreciate the work that the Council's done. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Secretary Vilsack. I have the opportunity now to do two things before we close. One is to thank so many people who helped us with this conference, and second is to summarize our day. So first, of course, we want to thank our speakers and moderators, and especially Secretary Vilsack, Ambassador Rice, Minister Kalibata, and our friend always Administrator Shaw. We want to thank our lead sponsor, Abbott, our sponsors, DuPont, Monsanto, and the Good Growth Plan, the support from the next generation sponsors, Cargill, Land O'Lakes, and Novus International. And then we're always grateful for the generous support of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Thank you to our civil society partners, and also, of course, as was stated earlier this morning, to our principal author, Gerald Nelson, who presented this report that got so many accolades today. There are many Chicago Council staff who have done an incredible job helping us to put all of this together. And they, if they're here in the room, perhaps could stand. Well, starting with Mr. President, thank you very much, Ivo Dulder, for your leadership here. Marjorie Burdetsky, Matt Burdetsky, Cassandra Carter, Anna Edwards, Melissa Gunin, Melanie Hannon, Kimberly Hayes, Stephanie Hines, Louise Iverson, Megan Keefe, Sung Lee, Trin Liu, Elizabeth Lula, Elizabeth Marquardt, Matt McGuire, Lisa Moon, our leader, Rachel Murphy, Tria Raimundo, Natalie Schienemann, Sam Skinner, Kavita Sood, Laura Sousa, Tyler Strom, Sarah Warner, January Zell. Please join me to say thank you to all. Advancing food security in the face of climate change. The weather is changing. How do we ensure, we decided today or discussed today, that we have increased production, increased access to food, support for those most impacted, but at the same time, at worst, not contribute more to climate change, and at best, grow more but decrease impact on climate change. As two of the speakers in the two first panels, Mr. Riley and Mr. Masaniwa, said, it's not rocket science. Many people said it doesn't cost a lot more money, but we have to be smarter. It shouldn't be political with a big P or small p, and it can be accomplished by smarter policies, more partnerships, more private sector investments, continued and expanded government commitments. The first priority that Doug outlined this morning was the priority of having a continued and even stronger commitment by the U.S. government for food security. As Ambassador Rice pointed out, the Obama administration has made major efforts in this regard, and Raj Shah was kind enough to credit the Chicago Council for the intellectual underpinning of much of that work. In Congress, we know there have been there has been progress, including in the Farm Bill, although sometimes it's two steps forward, one step back, as some of us know who had been working here on this project. But we know that ultimately what we need to do is to work with members of Congress to ensure that food security is in law. Raj talked about how we're hoping to start to create a new American ethic to lead on food security and ending hunger. We've always had an American ethic toward work to end hunger, but it's been through food aid. And now the shift is, let's shift this toward helping farmers become more productive themselves. Or if I could paraphrase an old Chinese saying and update it, teach a woman to fish, rather giving her a fish. This conference gave us more definition to why this was important, why there's many kinds of security, as was said, food security being one of them, and they're all interrelated, why this is a social good and a moral obligation. And two of our first two speakers, Michael Gerson and Bill Riley, as well as three speakers, Carolyn Miles, all highlighted the impact on the poor. And in fact, Michael Gerson said that climate change is magnified for poor people who did the least to create it and have the least resources to be able to handle it, and all said, especially women and children. We did more at this conference to define smallholder farmers, define the people that are most impacted, define farmers as business people, farmers as women and men. The ambassador used the pronoun she when she referred to African farmers, in fact. And we talked about the workers on farms, women, men, girls, and boys, and even the age of farmers, as Patrick O'Toole said. I think if I quote him correctly, the average age of farmers shouldn't be me. And we also talked about climate. My favorite quote was Judith Schwartz, I think, who said, we usually think about climate as the sky, but it's also the land. And we did indeed talk a lot about the land. When we talked about more research, and there was a lot of discussion about why we needed more research, probably most direct was from Minister Kalibata, who said we need more scientists on board. For instance, we see more diseases now that it's warming. But Lester Brown talked to us about water shortages becoming even a larger problem than available land, and there was a lot of discussion about the need for more research in this area. Syngenta told us they were going to have more production with less inputs, presumably including less water. And then we also learned about the Water Efficient Maize in Africa program, for which many people have very high hopes for its success. Ronnie Green told us that water is the new oil. Certainly is an area that needs more attention and more research, as was called for in the report. Food waste reduction, we talked about from a lot of different perspectives, how food waste also loses water, how climate change is exacerbated, how infrastructure is needed, how waste can be used to create energy. But the one disagreement that we had was on the value of cow manure. There definitely were different opinions. And when the report called for more and better data, we heard a lot of examples for that, more market data on a large and small scale. Mobile solutions, we heard proposals from one of our presenters this morning, proposals like iHub, iCow, and about focusing more information on farmers, on women and men. And then we heard from our government representatives in the US about data.gov, about sharing data. And also, even when we talked about trade, we were reminded by the Undersecretary of USDA that trade is not just on the ocean, but it's also about cross-border. So data becomes important there too. And it also obviously is critical when we talk about weather and risk management. This was an amazingly rich conference. My 5 minutes do not do it justice. But if I were to summarize all together where I hope we all are, that we leave here with a renewed enthusiasm and even more positive outlook, that there are many, many potential solutions, that there are even more people dedicated to try to work together in order to put these solutions in place, that food security, even in climate change, is achievable in our lifetimes, no matter whether we're old farmers or new ones, young ones, and that working together, we can achieve much. Let us leave this conference today committed to doing that, committed to working with the United States government to further promote these ideas, to put them into law, and to work together on behalf of poor farmers in the developing world, to give them, those women and men, girls and boys, the basics that they need to be able to succeed on their own. Thank you. Good night.